Chapter 1336. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1336. This way, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1336. This way Lionel's expression flickered. He recognized the little puppy almost instantly. It was the very same little beast that had been following behind Simona. Clearly, the little one had gotten separated from its owner during the forced teleportation. Why is it quivering, though? A beast that could follow her around shouldn't be so cowardly. Lionel frowned, making the decision to turn away. Even if this beast was cowardly, there was no way that it was weak. And, at this level, beasts should definitely have intelligence no weaker than an average human, some even surpassing this level. He couldn't just randomly pick up a puppy for no reason. Shockingly, though, Lionel didn't get a chance to walk away before Aina appeared before the little one, bending over to pick it up. The little puppy dodged backward, its speed confirming Lionel's thoughts. Just the fact this little beast could survive so well within this thick anarchic force spoke for itself. There was no way that it was weak. Don't tell me that. Lionel felt a headache coming along. His father often said things about women that would end up with him sleeping on the couch if his mother was around. Among those things was his disdain with their fascination with cute things. Now that Lionel thought about it, everything his dad said about female nature was probably another trick he used to lure another into his bed. Lionel usually rolled his eyes when his dad said such things. But, if Aina was really doing this for the sake of cuteness, it seemed he would have to give his old man a point in his favor. This definitely wasn't the time to be soft-hearted. Lionel still remembered that the first time he met Little Blackstar he tried to kill him. Luckily, the little one was practically invulnerable to attack. Though, Lionel recalled feeling exasperated at the time. Now, this situation felt eerily similar. It's okay, little guy. Just come with me. Aina smiled a beautiful smile, her golden irises twinkling. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The little purple puppy hesitated. But, under Aina's coaxing, and likely a bit of her mental coercion, the little one was forced into her arms. Lionel's internal sight continuously swept through the surroundings as far as it could go. His range was even less here than it was in the forest previously. If not for his breakthrough in the heavenly body realm, he might have trouble stretching it past just his skin. Aina rose from the ground with the puppy in her arms. Right then, she suddenly tossed it through the air at Lionel. Put it in a snow globe. Though Lionel was caught off guard, his reaction speed was very fast. Before the little puppy could react, it was trapped in a frozen time loop, unable to do much of anything except enter a deep sleep. Lionel raised an eyebrow. What? Aina asked. Did you think I stopped because it was adorable? With this, shall owe you a favor. Lionel speechlessly watched as Aina turned and broke out into a sprint once again. As he followed, he couldn't help but wonder if he was having a bad influence on her, or if she was always this savage. Something was telling him that it was the latter. A third-party observer would definitely look at Lionel like he was an idiot. It wasn't the countless people she had decapitated with her axe that made her savage, but rather tricking a puppy into a benign cage that was. It was either he was blind or a love-struck fool. Lionel's lip couldn't help but curl upward. It was hard to tell if he even realized it was happening. Right then, the pair came to a grinding halt. A fork lay ahead, making it difficult to tell which direction to go. It wasn't the first time they had come across a fork. However, before, the direction of the wind had made it easy to decide which way to go. This time, though, both paths seemed identical wind-wise and they didn't have enough information about where they were in the hive to make a decision based on the direction either. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel stopped by Aina's side, his brow furrowed. He took deep, steady breaths, ignoring the foul smell in the air. Is it possible based on smell? Lionel asked. Aina had said that she was very sensitive to these things, so maybe she had a general idea of where the nutritious nutrients she had sent before were. Even if it wouldn't be a 100% guarantee, they would just have to pick the direction opposite of it and hope that the pathway didn't curl or turn oddly. Unfortunately, Aina shook her head. The strong winds override the natural movement of the scent a lot. There's no difference between following the wind and following the smell, Lionel nodded. He had expected as much. So, it was a 50-50 chance, huh? Lionel very much doubted that both paths would lead to an exit. Or, even if they did both do so, he was certain that one would be safer than the other. Let's do it based on this, then. These nests probably need a large supply of water. Since we're guessing anyway, let's do it based on which direction has the weakest water force concentration. Aina's brows suddenly shot up. That's not a bad idea. But, instead of doing it with water force, let me do it with life force. Lionel nodded. This was indeed the better idea. He had almost forgotten that one of Aina's main affinities was life force. It was already high before she removed her curse. He could only imagine what level it had risen to now. This way. Lionel didn't refute Aina. Logically, the location with the highest life force would be the direction of the core of the nest. Not only would it have the strongest warriors guarding it, but it would also have the Rapak's eggs. Every time the pair came across a fork, they would take the same approach. However, the uneasiness in Lionel's heart grew every time they did. Their frequency only seemed to increase. Chapter 1337. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 58 seconds p.m. Chapter 1337. This king if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1337. This king, what's going on here, old man? I've never been stupid enough to enter a Rapak's nest, how the hell would I know? Lionel's heart felt uneasy. It was like his heartbeat had gone hollow, ringing in his ears and sending an odd wave of something slightly less than pain through his chest. It wasn't quite piercing enough to harm him, but it was too great to ignore at the same time. The more uneasy Lionel became, the colder his gaze got. Eventually, they began to flicker with a smoldering flame, the temperature around him even rising for a moment. Aina shifted her eyes from the path ahead to land on Lionel's side profile. But, not long after she did so, she found herself looking into his eyes. If it comes down to it and I try to bring you into the segmented cube, don't resist. Lionel spoke, his voice tinged with a hint of cold. Aina stared at Lionel deeply for a long while. It didn't seem like she would respond at all after a while. But, when she finally did, her choice of words were like a baffling sledgehammer to Lionel's chest. I am stronger than you. Lionel, who hadn't looked away from Aina, continued to do so. Despite the fact the words should have been shocking, he didn't seem to react like it was at all. His pace didn't falter, his expression didn't change, and his heart seemed to have regained its calm bearing. Don't think that I'm just saying that to say that. Aina continued. I'm not making it up, nor am I only stronger than you by a small measure. Aina didn't need to make it up. When her and Lionel's internal sights fused, she realized that her ability could be extended to others through this incredibly intimate action. Though not as detailed as when she used it on only herself, she could tell Lionel's deficiencies and had a vague idea of the path he could take to improve himself as well. Of course, she would never give this information to Lionel because of how vague it was. It could very well be skewed. But, it was still enough for her to tell the gap between them. Lionel hadn't been joking when he said that Aina would be a greater challenge for him than Miguel would be. In fact, Lionel hadn't yet caught up to where Miguel would be at 100% since he had yet to catch up to Aina. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. I already know this. Lionel responded, his voice not wavering. Aina's brows furrowed. However, if I fought 10 people just as strong as you, I would still win 10 out of 10 times. Lionel's violet hair danced in the wind, a stronger tinge of purple suddenly suffusing within them. At that moment, Aina's furrowed brows slowly relaxed, her limbs becoming looser and her stride becoming wider. Her hair fluttered as well, a deep coercion reflecting all impurities from her body. Lionel looked ahead as well, exhaling a heated breath, his body seeming to glow. I really hate you. Aina suddenly said. Then why do you follow me? Lionel asked without missing a beat. Because I also love you. Aina replied, her tone even. A silence fell between the two. The sounds of their steps were so light that nothing of their passage was left behind. As for little Blackstar, he was even less of a problem, gliding through the air as though it was solid ground and vanishing into the void without the slightest issue like a fish on water. I love you, too. Aina's eyes widened, her head suddenly snapping in Lionel's direction. But, before she could react, she found a hand having appeared on her shoulder. Leon. Aina vanished into the segmented cube just as Lionel rounded a final corner. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Aina stood in a daze within the expanse of the segmented cube for just a moment before her fury bubbled over. A violet rouge fog erupted around her, her hair grew to the length of a river and her gaze became like a piercing dragon's. She roared, her rage so palpable that the garden around her was vanquished into an ashy pit under nothing other than the oppression and density of her force alone. The worst part about it all was that she couldn't tell whether she was more enraged by the fact Lionel had done this to her again, or if it was because she had no idea whether Lionel had meant those words he had just said or had just used them as a method to distract her into not resisting. Aina's head rose into the skies, roaring at what felt like nothing. She broke through another tier, entering tier 6, and yet she didn't seem to notice in the slightest. Lionel stood on the other side of the corner, his breathing steady and his gaze cold. What he saw across from him, though, was enough to make almost anyone else's heart freeze over. The ruined Raypack stood as though it had been waiting all along. Though its demeanor was different from a human's, Lionel could still feel the air of nonchalance around it. Even after noticing Lionel, it hardly reacted, it stood in place, its body as unwavering as a mountain. Its body was an entire meter taller than the Raypacks Lionel was used to, standing at 4 meters even with its overly slouched back. The very same silver plates danced across its body. However, there was a very distinct difference, here. All across its plated armor, dense, swirling tattoos of black could be found, giving it both a profound air of majesty and a secondary air of oppression and warlike violence. Lionel's veins pumped with a reddish gold, his skin beginning to glow as bronze runes awakened all across his body. With every exhale, another heated fog would manifest until his body was coated from head to toe in a gorgeous silver and sky blue armor. Lionel could very clearly see the spurs that had begun to grow on its pill-shaped head. They were subtle and not too large, but they were enough to tell Lionel what he needed to know. Spurs on the tail denoted the 5th dimension. Spurs on the head, though, denoted the 6th. Lionel's force erupted. Come on, you alien piece of shit. This king has a beauty to protect. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1338. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 56 seconds p.m. Chapter 1338. Blind spot. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1338. Blind spot. Lionel's body erupted with a swirl of fog. A dense blackness, an oppressive violet, and a deep crimson. Without the slightest hesitation, he activated. Bang! The air around Lionel exploded, the oxygen around his feet releasing crackling booms of violent chain reactions as the flames within him ignited. It filled Lionel's body up to the brim with vital force, accelerating his healing factor and pushing his body to the brink, pushed him past those limits. From the very beginning, combustion was meant to take advantage of Lionel's nodal pathway, igniting his blood and surrounding his heart in a wreath of flames. In this state, his body was at its very strongest. Give me everything you have. 2 orbs of crimson hovered in place of Lionel's eyes, the viciousness of his demeanor finally making the ruined Raypack somewhat more alert. Yip! Yip! Little Blackstar body seemed to double in size, his fur standing on end and his long whiskers jetting outward like finely pointed needles. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. However, under Lionel's orders, little Blackstar didn't move at all. Hovering in the air, a strong surge of might came out from the little guy, suddenly causing the force in the surroundings to begin to increase in density and the anarchic force to concentrate. Lionel had only given Blackstar a single command: make them choke on anarchic force. Bang! Lionel sent out 4 punches in quick succession, his forward momentum and the twist of his hips fusing as one to bear down upon the ruined Rapax. For this creature, who was very much used to its overbearing pressure severely weakening opponents it felt was far weaker than itself, this was something completely unexpected, resulting in Lionel's fists actually landing. The harsh sounds of metal banging against metal resonated through the air, ripples of concentrated wind and sparks of volatile flames flying off in every which direction. The ruined Rapax found itself sliding back against the stone ground, its large, curled claws scraping against the ground and leaving behind shallow imprints. A short silence followed. The ruined Rapax's head seemed to tilt downward, its gaze, or what Lionel thought was its gaze, looking down at the region where the latter's fists had landed. It seemed surprised that such an ant would actually dare to attack it. Or, maybe it was surprised that it had actually been pushed back. The ruined Rapax looked back up. The silver shell that covered its head didn't seem to have any slits for eyes, making it difficult to tell if it was really looking at all. But, the feeling, at least to Lionel, felt the exact same. Bang! Maybe the ruined Rapax had thought its nonchalant reaction would affect Lionel, or maybe it thought that the intimidation of its growing and more serious aura would at least cause him to pause. Whatever the reason, the ruined Rapax stood unmoving as Lionel launched yet another series of attacks, seemingly just as baffled as the first time. Lionel didn't even seem to register the failure of his first volley of attacks. In fact, he only grew more furious, the relentless pursuit of a stronger and stronger attack barreling down upon the ruined Rapax. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net, SSKRE. The movement of the ruined Rapax was so sudden and fast that Lionel only had the time to cross his arms above his head. Even replaying his perfect memory, Lionel couldn't find the image of the Rapax having raised its leg, and yet by the time he registered it, a vicious axe kick had nearly crumbled him to his knees from above. In inaction, the ruined Rapax had been as steady as a mountain. However, the moment it moved, it was like a relentless, explosive avalanche, the monstrosity of its attack power feeling like enormous implosions going off within Lionel's body. Even with his bronze runes fully activated, just this one attack alone made Lionel feel as though his body was collapsing. Still, even in such a situation, the fierce glow in Lionel's gaze didn't falter. In fact, despite their crimson hue, they seemed decidedly cold. Thoughts of everything else vanished, his entire mind focusing on the creature before him. Even without the ability to lock onto it with his internal sight, Lionel dissected everything he could, an eerie calm cooling his head. Blind spot. That was Lionel's ultimate conclusion. This Rapax was using a special style that took advantage of its innate ability to avoid detection of internal sight. Like this, it was able to levy attacks using speed and timing to make it seem as though it had practically teleported into place. This was exactly why, despite standing right before it, Lionel had somehow missed a leg raising into the air. It took Lionel just a single exchange to comprehend this, and he adjusted accordingly. Bang! Under the relentless pressure, Lionel's knees crashed in the ground, his forearms threatening to shatter entirely. However, almost the instant the ruined Rapax rose its leg, so too did Lionel rebound from the ground. It looked as though he had used the hard stone as a trampoline, fighting back against the strike of the ruined Rapax just enough to have such an effect. The ruined Rapax had already prepared a second attack, but Lionel leapt over it, his knees tucking and his arms spreading out as though to balance himself in the air. If the ruined Rapax could display human emotions, its eyes would have most definitely widened even as its brows shot up. It had executed its technique perfectly. How had this human, clearly in such a bad situation, dodged? Lionel landed on the ground as light as a feather, his body exploding forth as he landed a vicious kick on the side of the ruined Rapax's knee joint. He drilled everything he had into it, his vital force, destruction capabilities, and universal force all coming together to form a torrent of wind that even manifested from the other side of the ruined Rapax's tough shell as well. Chapter 1339. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 55 seconds p.m. Chapter 1339. Vessel. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1339 Vessel. Lionel didn't wait for the result of his attack. He instantly erupted with the full force of the heavenly body realm, rotating to the back of the ruined Rapax in one fluid motion. As expected, Lionel's attack wasn't nearly strong enough to snap the ruined Rapax's knee. But it was just enough for it to lose its balance while it had a leg in the air. And, just as predicted, its tail quickly flickered, stabbing into the ground with a dull thump to keep it upright. Even for a sixth-dimensional ruined Rapax, stabbing through a ground of a seventh-dimensional world like this, especially one continuous tempered by the erosion of anarchic force, was a difficult task. The result was its scorpion-like tail catching a small bit of earth before slipping, only to quickly stab down again to achieve true balance. But, by the time it had done this, Lionel was already to its back, his fists glowing like two radiant suns as a moon and planet appeared to his back. The moment they did, Lionel's dark ice domain erupted, making the ruined Rapax feel as though its body was stuck in limbo. Lionel's gaze flashed, his mind entirely focused on the tender flesh of the ruined Rapax. His star constructs shrunk down violently beneath his command, their strength concentrating into fine points as level 2 golden spear force manifest under Lionel's will. Bang! Bang! Scree-cree! Lionel drew blood. The spurt of bluish liquid reflecting in his irises as two holes appeared on either side of the ruined Rapax's spine. However, despite the minor victory, Lionel's expression didn't shift even the slightest bit. With smooth steps, he glided backward, dodging the whipping tail of the ruined Rapax. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com. To experience faster update speed with a thought, Lionel's meteor construct manifested. Following the momentum of the furiously whipping tail, the beam of metallic gold enveloped the scorpion-like spikes and increased its weight several-fold, causing the ruined Rapax to misjudge and overcorrect, veering its tail off course and out of its control for a few precious fragments of a second. Lionel's moon construct flashed, the ruined Rapax conceptualization of time dilating. In those moments, the ruined Rapax felt as though it had suddenly entered a dream. No matter how fast it ran, it wasn't fast enough. But, in this case, no matter how much strength it put into swinging its tail back after missing, it didn't seem like enough. The gorgeous white planet to Lionel's back layered this effect. While the moon attacked the ruined Rapax's mind, the planet construct attacked its physical body, fusing with the affecting of the meteor construct and pressing down with an oppressive gravity. The fluidity of Lionel's actions were seamless. One action rolled into the next, his mind working at warp speeds and his calculations becoming more and more precise with each passing second. The ruined Rapax found itself swinging from being off balance on one side to suddenly overcompensating and being caught completely off balance toward another. It was right then that Lionel's second prepared attack flourished. His spear domain crown glowed, shimmering with a blinding golden light that washed the dark tunnels in a kingly might. His vital force brought his body to the very brink, the flames surrounding his heart forcing it to heat up and pound relentlessly. And finally, his forces fused into one, pilling on top of one another relentlessly. Lionel had learned a lot about his spear domain lineage factor after his recent breakthrough. While it seemed like the only change was that his spear force had gone from a more normal and bland white color to a piercing gold, this was far from the case. Lionel had come to understand that while his spear force could be powerful on its own, it could also act as a vessel and conduit for his other strengths. Why was it that every spear domain spear felt so unique? Each had its own unique element or ability to it. Such a thing felt odd. Should they be more focused on the purity of the spear itself as a weapon? Why was it that some focused on water, others on fire, yet others on lightning or light? The answer to that was simple. From the very beginning, the spear domain lineage factor was capable of absorbing all things, becoming the foundation of a warrior's style no matter what kind of ability or other affinities they might have. So, when Lionel fused his light elemental, fire elemental and star elemental forces into his spear force, it was as though a dry land had suddenly been blessed with a flood of water. It greedily swallowed it all, its insatiable greed fueling its rise in power. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. That's it. A crack. suddenly resonated in Lionel's mind, his irises flickering to life as a red-gold rune formed within their midst. As though being infused with a raging new power, Lionel's spear force gained a tinge of crimson, forming into a drill under the strength of his star constructs and aiming for the back of the runed Rapax once again. Bang! The result was far outside of expectations. Lionel found himself being slapped flying, his ribs breaking in several places and a projectile of blood leaving his lips and marring the inside of his helmet. Lionel could only use the tendrils of darkness from his beast armor to break his impact against the wall, but even that hardly made it better. With a grunt, Lionel slid down an opposing wall, the menacing roar of a runed Rapax bearing down on him. The runed Rapax's mouth had split over, revealing a long row of sharp, saliva-dripping teeth and a tongue longer and more rugged than any Lionel had ever seen before. In the blink of an eye, it had already appeared above Lionel, its menacing mouth dripping. Lionel coughed again, his gaze looking up as he slumped to the ground. It seemed that in the end, he wasn't able to predict the next attack like he had the first. Lionel had maximized his chances by minimizing the amount of times the runed Rapax could attack, but he couldn't seal the deal. However, even now, Lionel's gaze was unmoved. "Haven't noticed something wrong with your body yet?" Lionel asked coldly. The runed Rapax froze. Fallen Apostle ebook should be live in 4-ish hours, I think, or whenever the 24th is for you. If not, it will be sometime tomorrow. Big thanks to you guys for always supporting me. A linkture. EE/Ospec, October 23, 22. Chapter 1340. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 53 seconds p.m. Chapter 1340. No use if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1340. No use. The concentration of anarchic force in the region had reached a point the runed Rapax had never experienced before. In its rage, and also thanks to Lionel's moon construct dilating its senses, it hadn't noticed until it was far too late. And, to make matters worse, albeit just as small wounds, the open gashes on its back seemed to become a prime spot for the most vicious force in the universe to assault. Lionel had thought a lot about the Rapax in recent days. Among what fascinated him the most, aside from their ability to escape detection of internal sight, was their odd use of force. This race of being didn't use force like humans did. Or, rather, they might have only done so in part. They didn't pull on atmospheric force and seemed to rely entirely on what their bodies could produce. It could be said that they were completely antithetical to much of the battle style Lionel had forged in recent years. Because of his apprehension toward his Scarlet Star Force innate node, Lionel rarely if ever used his internal force, relying entirely on outside measures. However, what was truly interesting was that after beginning to use his nodal pathways and force nodes as he should, Lionel was still very much certain that his efforts were different from the Rapax. It was something deeper than just using internal force, something more profound. Even when Lionel used his internal force, it didn't seem as fused and one with him as what the Rapax could accomplish. It was clear that the Rapax were fusing with their force on a much deeper level, a level Lionel couldn't fathom. And, that was when it clicked. How was it that Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor worked? Well, his bronze runes became the conduit by which he could absorb the essence of ores and foundationally change his body. It etched onto his bones, his inner organs, and even his blood vessels. When thinking to this point, was it truly a coincidence that the most powerful of the Rapax were known as runed Rapax? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The mechanism was likely not the same, obviously. But, Lionel felt that it was highly likely to be similar. And, just like Lionel had runes within his body that others could see with the naked eye, so too would the Rapax. With that thought in mind, Lionel realized that this should have been the source of the Rapax strength. They absorbed force during their practice and infused it into the runes. Upon doing so, they could assimilate with this force, fuse with it, and make it their own, thereby strengthening their bodies manifold over. So, why was this so important now? It was because all the precious source of force that the runed Rapax pulled upon was within its body, and it was precisely these sort of dense regions of force that anarchic force liked to latch onto and swallow the most. Lionel believed that if he could just make the Rapax suffer a wound, a deep enough gash that its blood flowed and the anarchic force could get a taste of, the creature would suddenly find itself in a predicament that it would be hard-pressed to crawl out of. Scree! Lionel slowly stood from the ground, a hand across his chest and ribs as the Rapax struggled and screeched. The size difference between the two was enormous and the strength gap was even more exaggerated. And yet, it was Lionel who stood, a cold expression on his face and his aura bearing down as though this was just the obvious outcome. "There's no use in screaming," Lionel said lightly. "I've learned in recent times that the higher up in dimensions you go, the more reliant you are on the push and pull forces of force itself. It's quite fascinating, really. Even a shout won't travel as far in a higher dimensional world as it would in a lower one, let alone when the anarchic force is so great. Why do you think I dared to battle you instead of just running?" Lionel had no idea if the ruined Rapax could understand him, but he didn't seem to care, his cold eyes calculating everything as the Rapax soon found it difficult to even stand. The anarchic force concentration had been multiplied to the point there was practically no other force to pull upon in this region. Maybe the only two existences that could survive beneath such a concentration was a little beast with void beast blood and a man who had spent the last several months torturing himself on an even greater quantity. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net when Lionel seemed to have seen all he needed to see, he turned his head toward Little Blackstar. Yip! The little mink dove down. Unable to even resist at this point, the ruined Rapax could only put up a futile attempt at resistance before Blackstar exited out the back of its skull, having entered through its mouth. Before the ruined Rapax could die, though, Lionel sent it into a snow globe. He had no way of knowing if the Rapax sent out signals after their death or if there was a method of keeping track of them. Though he was quite confident in the concentration of anarchic force stopping pretty much everything, given the fact the Rapax had become used to this environment over such a long period of time, there was no way of telling whether they had more sophisticated methods of dealing with this, and Lionel didn't feel like finding out. Coughing heavily, Lionel looked down at his chest. That one kick had almost broken all of his ribs. In fact, he was lucky that each had only broken in one spot. If not for his sturdy body, the result would have likely been countless little shards of bones piercing through his lungs and heart. My healing factor is so slow in this world. Lionel debated whether or not he should use his. But, after a moment, he decided against it. He could still hang on. Picking a direction, he sprinted out of the dense concentration of anarchic force. Then, taking a deep breath and bracing for the worst, he brought Aina out once again. Bang! The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1341. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1341, Bang. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1341, Bang. Lionel coughed up another large mouthful of blood. Son of a bitch, he had gotten far too used to seeing this ceiling today. But, he hadn't expected to see it after saving a beauty. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Who wrote this bullshit? Unfortunately, it wasn't over. Lionel had hoped that a single strike would be enough to vent her rage, but he had hardly rebounded off of an opposing wall when he found another fist nearing his face. Lionel reacted as quickly as he could, crossing his arms over his head. But, to his astonishment, it had been nothing more than a feint. What looked like a dainty hand, completely dwarfed by the size of Lionel's own, smashed a fist into his chest, sending Lionel into the wall again. The pain wrecked Lionel's body, his partially healed ribs cracking cleanly once again with an audible snap. With how powerful Lionel's body was, every injury he suffered was like metal being snapped in two. Even his muscles themselves were like intertwining steel cords, layered atop of one another with a strength that spoke for itself. The second wave of pain seemed to snap Lionel awake, the helplessness in his gaze vanishing and leaving behind a hidden sharpness. Lionel immediately entered a defensive position, tucking his elbows to the side of his body and raising his fists to opposing sides of his face. Like this, he could finally see the rampaging Aina before him. If it wasn't for the ridiculous situation he was in, he might have spared a thought for how much of a war goddess she seemed to be right this moment. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Her tight beast skin clothing clung to her curves, her muscles pulsing with a vibrant power. She released a barrage of kicks and fists, entering a furious berserk state as though she wanted nothing more than to see Lionel beaten into minced meat. Lionel couldn't seem to find a gap to counterattack. Aina's assault was seamless, and even though she rarely used her fists and legs like this, her battle sense didn't seem to take even the slightest hint. In fact, after just a handful of exchange, a glow took hold of Aina's body and Lionel's brow furrowed. Fist force. Suddenly, Aina's attacks became sharper. Lionel realized he couldn't stay on his back foot like this, or else all he would be was a glorified punching bag. Even his metallic body was starting to feel as though it was being kneaded into a soft dough beneath this woman's relentless barrage. He took a strong step forward, taking advantage of his powerful defenses and swinging a punch-out that ignored everything. He just needed to break Aina's rhythm, just enough that he could find a chance to counter. However, he had only just opened up his defenses when Aina's figure seemed to flicker, her fist connecting with his chin as though there was a magnet connecting the two. Lionel felt his head spin, his hook losing momentum. Without dream sense, he couldn't shake his mind awake fast enough, and he quickly suffered a shin to his hip mere instants later. Damn it. Aina's violent barrage seemed to leave craters in Lionel's body. He bounced around like a pinball. Every time it seemed like he would escape, he'd find another fist or foot in his path, throwing him back from whence he came. That's enough. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel's roar was like a clap of thunder, however it didn't waver Aina's assault in the slightest. It rolled off her shoulders as though it was never there, but by then, Lionel's gaze had already become a frightening cold. The Aina reflected in his gaze became nothing more than a slab of meat, a simulation hovering within his dream world. Going from the difficulty in calculating a Rapak's next move to the ease of calculating a human seemed to fuel Lionel with a sharper mind. It was like he had just spent years in a low-oxygen environment, only to suddenly have all the air he could breathe at once. His body thrummed like it had been hit with a spike of dopamine, his movements suddenly becoming so sharp and calculated that Aina was forced to take her first step backward. Fists and knees clashed as though cinder blocks. It didn't sound like the resonating echoes of flesh and bone. Rather, the two were like machines of war, commanding their mechs to leave devastation in their wakes. What Lionel lacked in battle prowess, his mind made up for in spades. What Aina lacked in calculative ability, her innate senses and reflexes covered for several times over. The two were like a whirlwind, twin cyclones rampaging about and only seeming to grow more and more violent with each passing moment. Their eyes locked across the short distance that separated them, their irises flickering with an undisguised coldness. Bang! 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 Elbows, knees, feet, even a headbutt or two when they seemed to have completely run out of methods to attack. They were absolutely relentless, seemingly holding nothing back. Little Blackstar hopped in the air from side to side, completely agitated. It was like the poor little guy was watching his parents fight and didn't even know how to go about stopping it. The little mink could only let out exasperated yips from time to time, making it seem like he was trying to get to them to stop, but to no avail at all. It was as though the two had completely forgotten that they were in enemy territory. In fact, with the way things looked now, maybe it was lucky the Rapaks didn't come across them in such a state, or else the first to be ripped apart would definitely be them. Bang! Their fists collided through the air, both being forced to skid back. Their arms hung in the air, their eyes still glaring at one another. Hot air billowed out of both of their mouths, their lungs and limbs screaming. However, they didn't speak a single word. Chapter 1342. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 1342. Familiar words. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1342. Familiar words. Little Blackstar was caught between relief and panic. Even though the constant barrage had finally come to a stop, the little guy was emotionally intelligent enough to know that things wouldn't just end with that. Maybe the two had only stopped at this point because past this was most definitely a state of no return. Their stamina already seemed to have taken a large hit. If they went any further, they really wouldn't be able to deal with any danger that came. I should have done this years ago. Aina spoke coldly. You must think I'm really afraid of you. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, and clearly it's because I've been too easy on you. Lionel's lip twitched. This woman seemed to have entered a demonic mode. I promise you this. Every time you do this to me, I will beat you until you're completely unrecognizable. Last time I just ran away and apparently that made you think me to be soft. It won't happen again. Lionel suddenly got the impulse to touch his face, only to realize that his raised arm looked as though he had stuffed several balloons beneath his skin. His expression flickered, and by the time he actually touched his face, he realized that it was completely swollen as well. It was then that Aina's words about beating him until he was unrecognizable seemed to ring in his ears again. She wasn't just saying that, she had been serious. Her control of her strength was so great that her every punch, kick, knee, and elbow managed to generate the greatest damage to his flesh, resulting in these exaggerated bruises all across his body. Lionel had been so certain that his aches and pains were from his battle with the ruined Rapax that he didn't even notice that he was being turned into a charity case. Lionel was speechless. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Every time you do this to me, I will beat you until you're completely unrecognizable. He could see by the fire lit in her eyes that she really meant it. It didn't matter if they were in the middle of a Rapax nest, if they were deep within enemy territory, maybe even if they were in the middle of fighting a war, she would truly drop everything to beat him up. What kind of nonsense was this? The worst part was that even though it felt like a joke, Lionel could feel how livid Aina was. The fact she had only gone so far was actually an outward showing of restraint for her. If she really unleashed everything, it wouldn't be her fists cutting into his body, but rather a bloody axe. Aina was right. Last time he did this to her, she had just left everything and disappeared. This time, however, it seemed she had taken a different approach. But this sort of approach wasn't something that Lionel cared for at all, especially not when he had just cracked his ribcage open to ensure they could both get to safety. Rather than being thankful for that or showing any appreciation, he was actually greeted with more pain. Fine. He had already been prepared for the backlash his actions would come with. But, wasn't this too far? If she wasn't, Lionel's brow furrowed when his thoughts reached this point. He never usually cared if an enemy was female or not. Had anyone else done this to him, he would have definitely did far more in revenge. He didn't like this weight hanging around his every action when it came to this woman. It was like he couldn't be his true self. Lionel lowered his fist, his expression only becoming colder. And yet, Aina stood right across from him, her expression not softening in the slightest at all. Her demeanor seemed to scream that no matter what Lionel said, she would meet him from lower ground, even if that lower ground required a fist. If you can't understand why I do things the way I do, what's the point? My mom said something very important to me a few months ago. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. Trying to change a person will never work. You're doing nothing but wasting your time. Every time this situation happens, I will take the same course of action. No amount of tantrums you throw will change that. And, if there ever comes a day where this tantrum of yours really compromises our ability to survive, well, you've made a promise yourself, I can promise that in such a situation, I'll disregard any mental blocks I have toward harming you entirely. Trust me. If there's one thing I'm good at, it's getting rid of mental blocks. I hope you'll show some propriety and not allow things to get that far. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Aina stared at Lionel deeply, her own oppressive aura still rising. Even the earth seemed to rumble beneath her. I can promise you if that day really does come, I won't hold back either. If you think you're the only one holding back, you have another thing coming. My axe won't show mercy. Lionel's brows furrowed, his frown deepening. After a moment, though, his expression completely relaxed, a detached sort of appearance being all that was left. If that's how things are, then it's better for us to go our separate ways. I can't have a liability who can't understand how I see things by my side. You'll be nothing more than a ticking time bomb. Aina sneered. Understand how you view things? What about how I view things? The only thing that matters is my final decision. If you can't trust me to make it, then you might as well go call someone else king. Lionel's voice boomed, a wild violet aura raging around him. The oppression of his mind's coercion seemed to stream forward like a raging tide, a tsunami that only seemed to grow taller with every passing moment. However, Aina's rage somehow still seemed more palpable. Her hair fluttered wildly, her canines seeming to grow a measure as her irises sparkled like drops of ambrosia. A king also knows when to listen. You keep talking about trust this and trust that, but all you really want are blind followers that will both do everything you ask them to do on a whim, and yet also allow you to take control of everything at the same time. You keep asking me to have trust in you, but where's your trust in me? What's the point of building a kingdom if all you want to do is fight on your own? Do I look like a fragile flower to you? You're a hypocrite. A fucking sociopathic hypocrite. Lionel froze. Chapter 1343. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 1343. Northern Magnet. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1343. Northern Magnet. A hollow sound rang in Lionel's ears, almost as though an enormous explosion had gone off in his surroundings and now only an eerie sharpness of what remained of his hearing was left. Even with all the sensory perception and infallible memory in the world, in just those few seconds, it was as though his mind was blank. He couldn't see or hear anything, nor could he remember what kind of thoughts he was having. Lionel never hid anything from Aina. There were secrets he probably should have kept from everyone around him that would have probably made it easier to protect their safety that he had still chosen to tell to her. And there were secrets that weren't so important, but were far more personal, that he had still decided to tell her as well. But there were two things Lionel had never told Aina. Whether consciously or subconsciously, he never even began to express them. It was hard to tell if he had done it on purpose or if it was a sheer coincidence that he never got around to doing so. But one was hard-pressed to believe that two such important things just happened to be matters that Lionel didn't get around to telling someone he usually told everything about. The first was Lionel's true status as a dark prisoner. He never explained anything about his evaluation as a child, how this had estranged him from the Fox family when he might otherwise have grown up with a fine relationship with the royal family, or how Lionel had taken his place. The second, though, was related to the specifics of that night after Aina was forcefully teleported to Terrain. And how that night. The words Aina had just spoken were the exact words James had said to him that day. These were two memories that Lionel had long since buried deep within him, and with his control over his mind, he never thought about them. Unlike a normal individual who might stumble onto such thoughts from time to time and suddenly find themselves flashing back to that day, Lionel was completely different. It could be said that since those events happened, this was maybe only the first or second time he had thought of them. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. In that moment, he couldn't seem to escape it. Without access to Tier 4 of his ability index, he couldn't control the facets and knobs of his mind as easily as he could before, resulting in a relentless flood that bombarded his thoughts and threatened to turn his brain to mush. He could suddenly remember everything about that day. The devastation of the artillery shells that had fallen around them, the screams of women and children who were caught in the crossfire, and even the light reflected in James' eyes when he said those words, his father's gun still held to his temple. Are you sure that you want me to kill him? Lionel could remember looking deeply at James, still very much wanting his deductions to be wrong. Maybe it was a coincidence that the man holding a gun to James' head was so tall. Maybe the resemblance they shared was overblown by him. Maybe he had overestimated the strength of James' great energy shield ability and underestimated the power of a bullet. Maybe, just maybe, his best friend of over a decade wasn't trying to drag him toward his death. Just maybe, Just maybe he was wrong, for once. However, his mind was too sharp. He could see that change in James' expression immediately. He could feel his best friend's heart skip a beat even under the influence of all the noise. At that moment, he knew. He knew that the friend he had come to know was gone. I'm disappointed. I really took you as my closest friend. Lionel had meant those words more than anything. James was his closest friend, his best friend, his brother. Their personalities were hardly anything alike, but they were inseparable. It was the kind of relationship that Lionel couldn't explain even if he tried. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net if he was honest with himself, maybe James had just as much to do with his moral code than any of his father's teachings had. Being drilled again with the importance of respect and persistence was nice, but there were so many ways to interpret those two words. Who deserved respect? What kind of goals were worth being persistent in the face of? The answers to these questions was probably more important than the mantra themselves. If Lionel's father had been his compass, James had been the magnetic pole that wrenched him northward. This wasn't because James was so morally superior. In fact, James was an asshole, not much unlike how Lionel's father had been in his youth. He used women like rags, he didn't care enough to pay much attention in school, he put no effort into anything because his family was rich and famous, and he hadn't hesitated to attempt to betray the hopes of dreams of a team filled with his brothers for his own selfish goals. There was nothing about James that screamed moral direction. But that was ironically the very reason why he was so profoundly important to Lionel. Despite his flaws, despite how seemingly worthless he was, despite how by every observable metric that decided human value according to society labeling him a net negative, Lionel had always loved him. James had always been his brother. The first person he told about Aina, the only person who knew how much he hated playing quarterback, the only person who knew what was hidden behind his perpetual charismatic smile. To most others, James was worthless scum. And yet to Lionel, he was invaluable in a way that was just impossible to explain. And if even someone like James could hold such supreme value to him, then who was he to cast judgment upon the worth of anyone else? But, bullshit. James suddenly roared. You pretend to care about so many things, you pretend to be kind-hearted, but all you really care about are things ending up exactly like you want them. You don't like killing only because you don't want to deal with the guilt. You don't like playing football only because you didn't get to choose it. You only want to do things your way and nothing else matters. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1344. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 1344. A betrayal long ago. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1344. A betrayal long ago. Remembering back now, Lionel could understand why James had reacted that way. When he spoke his truth, saying that James was his closest friend, remembering the details of how it had happened now hit him like a ton of bricks. His voice had been so cold. So detached. So emotionless. It was as though he had said it all perfunctorily, as though he was shaking his head toward a child that had disappointed him rather than been heartbroken at the betrayal of a friend. By that point, he had already disassociated, ripping that part of himself out and ignoring it like he always had. Even when he knew that James had betrayed them during the biggest game of the year, Lionel hadn't said a word, just silently finding a method to win anyway. Just like he always did. He didn't approach James, he didn't ask him what was wrong, he just did things as he pleased, finding a solution that could please everyone. James got to appease whoever had commanded him to lose by making it obvious he had done his best, and Lionel got what he wanted, another victory. When the two met in the locker room, Lionel could remember how livid James had been. You knew you get the unnecessary roughness call, right? I know you too well. You don't like to lose, but you're too soft-hearted to call me out on my bullshit too. So you'd find a way to protect our friendship and ignore it, all while winning the big game anyway. Am I right? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. If you knew I needed your help, why couldn't you lose this one time? This is just a game, isn't it? You've already won it 3 times, did you really need to win a 4th? You don't even want to be a quarterback. The words still rung in Lionel's head, even down to James eventually apologizing. At least then Lionel had still been able to lace his words with some sort of emotion, some sort of understanding and sympathy. But, afterward, he seemed to have completely lost that ability. While he stood there months later, Aina gone from his side, his body beaten and tired, an entire fortress of enemies eagerly waiting to take his head. Lionel hadn't truly felt the weight of the events. He had been confused by James' words. He even remembered thinking them to be a jumbled mess of nonsense. He had even somewhat arrogantly thought that this was just another case of James not being quite eloquent enough to say what he needed to say, another example of his imperfect best friend displaying his lack of value to the world. But could Lionel still love him now? Even after such a betrayal? Was that even possible? You're a fucking sociopathic hypocrite. The world seemed to go white for Lionel. Lionel remembered that he said many more words after that, words that had even left James as white as a sheet and as silent as a mouse. But, in his ears now, those words seemed to ring hollow. Leaving James speechless wasn't a feat hadn't he arrogantly proclaimed that his so-called best friend wasn't very good with words to begin with? It was ironic. He loved James like a brother, and James could be said to be the very reason he didn't become the sort of person who could treat human lives like weeds. And yet, in order to come to that conclusion to begin with, hadn't he needed to assign some value to James? Didn't he need to mark him down as someone worthy or unworthy? Make a list of his deficiencies before deciding whether or not he was still worth loving or not? Whether he was still worthy of being his friend? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net when you thought about what that truly meant, it was sick. As though Lionel thought of James like a little pet project of his, a poor little boy who no one else wanted but that was okay because Lionel would take him under his wings anyway. Maybe James, in all his simplicity, could actually feel Lionel's true intent. While everyone else only saw Lionel for what he showed to the world, James saw Lionel for what he was. In all his flaws, some far more tragic than others. It couldn't be said that James was a good person. It was the direct opposite, in fact. He had put his own selfish desires above even the safety of Lionel's life. Maybe he had told himself that he would be able to use his influence over his father to ensure that Lionel would live even after being caught. But, that would have been nothing more than a coping mechanism for his own cowardice in being unable to stand up to his own father. However, this had only made it easier for Lionel to ignore his own flaws. James was the only person who knew him so intimately, the only person who understood how his brain worked and how he saw the world. Even if James couldn't put it into words, how would he have felt knowing that he was just another calculation to Lionel? An odd quirk in an otherwise logical world that Lionel was so fascinated by that he just had to keep him by his side? Maybe James wouldn't have been able to express exactly that in words, but he would have felt it. That sort of lingering inferiority. The kind that cast the mind into a perpetual, endless darkness. The very same kind of darkness he couldn't escape from in his own family and father. It probably would have felt to James that the friend he thought would always have his back had betrayed him long ago. That what they had built their friendship upon was nothing but a bed of lies that Lionel had concocted. Everything seemed to hit Lionel all at once. Like a rushing tsunami, it crashed into him, burying him deep. He suddenly found that he couldn't breathe, his face turning blue and his body suddenly not functioning properly anymore. Everything wanted to shut down around him. Chapter 1345. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 45 seconds p.m. Chapter 1345. Semantics. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1345. Semantics. How long had it been since he had access to Tier 4 of his ability index? Lionel only had a very vague understanding of abilities when he began his journey. However, by the time he had been able to comprehend, he had already entered Tier 4. It could be said that from the very beginning, he had always been in such a state. What did that mean? It meant that since the very moment Lionel had awakened his ability, he had gained with it a perfect sort of control over his body that extended to his mind. This sounded like a great thing, but when he was completely ignorant to what he was doing, he was essentially digging himself into a larger and larger hole every time. Whenever Lionel believed that he was able to easily cut off his emotions because that was just the kind of person he was, naively believing that this would have no impact on him since he could so naturally do it, the reality of it all was that this was just an example of his ability at work. It had to be understood that Lionel wasn't like the people of Earth. He had been born with his ability index and he didn't have to wait for the metamorphosis. The only reason it didn't manifest in full force until after the metamorphosis was because of actions his father had taken. Now, however, Lionel's ability index had suddenly been suppressed back down to Tier 3 for the first time and Lionel had no method of dealing with it. Aina, though, had no idea what she had just triggered within Lionel. Though it felt like a long time and that going through such a long list of memories had taken forever, the reality was that even after dropping down to Tier 3, his thinking speed was well beyond the imagination of most. It was to the point where Aina was still in the middle of speaking even after his body seemed to have hit a wall. I don't know why it's so difficult for you to understand. I know I was wrong in the past to make you want to stay away from danger, but can't we at least compromise? Is it so impossible to meet in the middle for you? Why can't we just fight together? That's not even the point. I wouldn't even mind if you had a plan that I couldn't be a part of, a plan that you know I'd be detrimental to. But would it be impossible for you to communicate that? Why are you so stubborn? Do you really see everything you go off and do on your own as heroic and protective? I don't see it that way at all. It's demeaning. It's like you can't be bothered to trust no one other than yourself because no one could possibly touch your lofty existence. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Aina's chest heaved, her gaze a furious shade of gold. But, it was right then that Lionel's figure stumbled, his hand involuntarily reaching for his chest and his face becoming a ghastly shade of blue. In order to maximize his efficiency, after learning the full extent of what being in Tier 4 meant, Lionel began to push himself past normal limits. Normally, even something most allowed their bodies to regulate like the cadence of their heart or the flow of their digestion was entirely controlled by Lionel. This allowed him to put his energy toward the best things imaginable. After his ability index fell down to Tier 3, these functions obviously shut off and were handed back to Lionel's body to regulate. The change was seamless as everyone's body was designed to handle this matter regardless. However, Aina's words seemed to have shocked Lionel and his mind was now in a state of fighting against itself. He wanted to wrest the control he had lost back to make these feelings go away, but the trouble was that he was no longer in Tier 4. If a normal person wanted to accomplish the impossible, they would just be finished. They would try to tap into abilities they didn't have and they would fail, end of story. But, the trouble was that Lionel had a lineage factor that quite literally gave his will strength. King's might. Now, Lionel's mind was in a furious state, wanting his ability to evolve and transcend its limits, but the anarchic force in the surroundings was simply too potent to allow such a thing. This sort of tug of war caused Lionel's body to completely shut down. His blood stopped flowing, his heart stopped beating, even his brain itself seemed to want to close up shop. Lionel? Lionel. Aina's expression warped wildly as she dove forward, catching Lionel's head just before it smashed against an opposing stone wall. But, she was immediately shaken when she felt just how cold his skin was. If there was one thing that Lionel was perpetually, it was hot. His fire affinity was so high that this was undeniably the case, there was simply no escaping it. Lionel's body went rigid before everything suddenly loosened. His skin and face went completely blue, his lips following soon even as the whites of his eyes bulged with red blood vessels behind their lids. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel. To Aina's horror, Lionel's heart actually wasn't beating at all. She immediately used everything she had learned as a 5-star medical professional of Earth, laying him down and beginning CPR, but it felt that no matter what she did, it wouldn't matter. Aina's face was filled with panic. She could have never drawn the conclusion that her words had caused this, so she immediately thought that it was because she had fought Lionel. The ruined Rapax must have left behind more severe wounds than she thought and her subsequent fight with Lionel must have triggered them. The guilt was enough to overshadow her world entirely, tears beginning to stream down her face completely outside of her control. Yip! Yip! An anxious little black star dove down from the air, pulling at Lionel's hair in hopes of waking him up before furiously licking at his cheek. Right then, something within Lionel snapped, his body convulsing. Lionel's eyes suddenly shot open, a blinding light beaming out from them as a force art more complex than words could describe began to revolve within them. In an unknown corner of the dimensional verse, a handsome middle-aged man yawned, shifting his glasses upward as he scratched his ass. At that moment, he looked upward, his mouth still open in mid-yawn form before he shook his head. Aya, that brat of mine is always ruining my plans. What is that, twice now? Why can't you just follow the normal schedule I so painstakingly drew out? You're going to make this old man seem incompetent. Ah, whatever. I have an excuse to see my beautiful wife again so soon. Hopefully she doesn't make a fuss about it being an avatar again. I'm trying to save the world here. It can't be that such small semantics is going to make a hero like me go without sex, right? Velasco tossed an odd ball of force casually, and yet it shot off into the distance, disappearing over the horizon near instantly. Chapter 1346. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 44 seconds p.m. Chapter 1346. Worse than changing diapers if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1346. Worse than changing diapers, Lionel. Aina had done everything she could, even pressing down so forcefully that the ribs Lionel hadn't broken yet snapped cleanly. But, she was well aware that when a medical professional had to choose between a few broken ribs and restarting a heart, there was almost no decision to be made. Bones could heal, but a dead heart would never come back. The sudden flash of Lionel's eyes gave Aina hope, but the sudden and dense cloud of auspicious air that began to grow in the surroundings almost made her suffocate. This was the first time she was experiencing auspicious air personally, but she somewhat knew what it was. The trouble was that she didn't understand why it was suddenly coming out of Lionel's body in droves like this. At that moment, a certain beam of light ripped through the cosmos, appearing on the outskirts of the void battlefield and diving through its barriers. In a blink, it had appeared above a familiar hive, and in another, it had already flashed into the segmented cube without even Aina's knowledge. The ball of force appeared in Lionel's room, a region he had begun to use to keep things meticulously organized. It could be said that his room had become his functional spatial ring. As usual, it was spotless and clean, not that Lionel used it very often to begin with. Tucked into a corner, a familiar silver disc sat. Without much hesitation, the force buzzed and entered the dictionary, causing the mechanisms within to snap into a different configuration, its gears dancing and complex runes beginning to form along its surface. In the next moment, the disc began to hover, leaving the shelf and was tucked upon as a looming shadow began to envelop it. In the blink of an eye, that shadow took form, becoming the outline and eventual real body of a man Lionel was all too familiar with. Velasco held the dictionary in his hands, flipping it in the air and letting it land onto his palms as he strolled out of the room. A Rapak's nest? It seems someone is getting greedy. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The moment Val stepped outside of Lionel's room, he raised an eyebrow, looking off in a certain direction. But, in the end, he completely ignored it. With a step, he vanished, appearing in the dense black fog of anarchic force alongside Aina and his brat of a son. Truthfully, it almost instantly became an awkward situation for Val. Aina was a mess, her tears coming out in a torrent. She alternated between using what felt like almost way too much force compressing Lionel's chest and kissing him with her, well, very snotty face. Val couldn't help but feel like he had walked into a melodramatic scene. But, when he looked at Aina again, he clicked his tongue. Not bad, at least this useless brat of mine gained at least a small bit of my skill. Despite the fact anarchic force was an excellent sound insulator, Val was simply too close in his presence even as an avatar. Well, it could be said that he had certain piercing qualities that made this concentration of anarchic force not too big of a deal. Who? Aina spun around, her axe leading her turn. Despite the state she had been in, she hadn't forgotten the kind of dangerous region they were in. From the very beginning, her senses had been primed. Oh my, is this how you greet your in-laws? Well, I can't say you're very different from my wife. Val flicked a finger upward just before Aina's axe could bury itself into his shoulder. Ding! The axe arched through the air and over his head, swinging in a long semicircle before just barely gliding over Lionel's nose and crashing into the ground. Aina's face turned completely pale for two reasons. The first was because she had no method of fighting back at all. And the second was because she had almost taken Lionel's head off, just an extra centimeter downward, and he would have been left with only a part of his nose. The worst part was that after being placed on its trajectory, Aina seemed to have completely lost the ability to alter its path. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net she ended up spinning completely around, her axe just barely slicing into the ground enough to stop. But the issue was that she knew that she didn't have nearly enough strength to cut into this stone. The strength difference was so enormous that she couldn't even fathom it. Even with her ability, she couldn't begin to make a plan on how she would get so strong. The peak was simply too tall. Aina was so dazed and worried that she didn't even register the words Val had spoken until several moments later. By the time she had thought of all sorts of methods she could use to run away with Lionel. When it clicked, though, she froze. What? Aina, whose hands had already found their grips latched onto Lionel's clothing, ready to leave her axe behind to rip him away, suddenly couldn't move. Val had already appeared on the other side of Lionel. He ignored Aina, shaking his head. Though he seemed unperturbed, this really was already the second time one of his plans didn't go as expected. Well, maybe it was to be expected considering what his actual goal was. Maybe even for him everything going too smoothly was too much to expect. Troublesome kid. This is worse than changing diapers. Val pressed a finger to Lionel's forehead. Almost the instant he did, half of the density of auspicious air vanished. Sealing it too much will probably have a contrary effect. I guess I should let it free itself a bit. The momentum of Val's press lessened somewhat, but the auspicious air continued to recede. It's not time yet, brat. Try to do things on a schedule for once. The complex force arts rotating within Lionel's eyes slowed, many portions of them vanishing until a far less complex force art remained. However, even that eventually vanished, its presence remaining barely a lingering thought. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1347. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 43 seconds p.m. Chapter 1347. At best, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1347. At best, slowly, the odd aura around Lionel seemed to recede. Eventually, even the natural color of his skin returned. It was obvious at a glance that this wasn't because his issues had been resolved, but rather because, for some odd reason, his ability index had returned to Tier 4, allowing him control over his body again. Val stood up and stretched. With a flick of his finger, he sent the dictionary back into the segmented cube and yawned. Welp, I'm going to go and see my wife now. Bye. Val began to stroll away without a care in the world. But such casual actions left Aina baffled. That was it? He was just going to leave just like that? W8. HM. Val turned back, looking down curiously. Lionel. What's wrong with him? Val blinked, looking toward his son. His mind is imbalanced. It's not entirely his fault, it could be said to be mostly mine. But, due to certain reasons, things need to stay this way for now or else the consequences will be even worse. Aina's expression sank. Then. Nothing's changed? From what Val said, it sounded like it was Aina's words and not her actions that had caused this. This didn't change the guilt she felt much at all. If it wasn't for Val's appearance, Lionel would have very likely died here and she was having a hard time reconciling with that fact. But, if nothing had changed and Lionel had only gone back to his baseline, that made things even worse. That meant that he had suffered like that for nothing. Even though Val's previous words seemed to imply that he would grow stronger, that wasn't something Aina cared about. She was more worried about Lionel's mind and his psyche from here on. What would she do? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Val hummed. That would depend. Anyway, try not to die. Val tried to leave again, but he was once again stopped by words Aina spoke. Given his usual temperament, he would have likely dashed away and pretended not to hear anything. But, given Aina's unique status, he guessed that he should probably be a bit more patient. He had heard his son talk about this girl for years, and this was the first time he was meeting her. Why? If you're so powerful, why put him through this? Val scratched his chin, pursing his lips a bit. Truthfully, he wasn't very much of a fan of explaining himself. He was usually right anyway. What was the point in getting the opinions of other people? Well, there was one woman who always forced him to explain himself anyway. Would he really get a daughter-in-law like that too? How much had he sinned in a previous life to deserve this? The world isn't as simple as you think it is, little girl. My real body isn't so free to do as it pleases. Though, I wasted 17 years raising this brat who keeps giving me more trouble every other day it seems. You know, that's not how the script is supposed to go. I was supposed to be the father that vanished after his birth, but a certain annoying family actually deemed to. Forget it, there's no point in talking about all this. All you need to know is that these matters aren't so simple, and if I don't do certain things, you two wouldn't get the chance to be two snotty-nosed brats making out in a rapak's nest. Aina's face turned a furious shade of red. Making out? She had been clearly performing CPR. How had it been twisted under the words of this man like this? Thinking back to all the things Lionel had told her about his father, Aina realized that he hadn't exaggerated at all. This man really didn't act his age, and apparently, he also didn't act in line with the power he had. Still, seeing that he was being so vague and not answering much of anything, Aina also understood that there wasn't much of a point in pressing. If Val had wanted to explain, he would have. Seeing Aina lower her head and fall into silence, Val sighed. He had grown soft, it seemed, feeling bad about such meaningless things. This was what happened when you had a wife and kids, your edge vanished. Eventually, this would come back to bite him. All right. Val waved his hand and a strong suction force formed. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. The segmented cube, still in its finger-wrap form, flew into his hands. I know you're awake, stop throwing a temper tantrum. Leave me alone. You son and father pair are just the same. Me? The same as this brat? Can't you see how much more handsome and suave I am? If he gained 10% of my skill, it would be his blessing. Aina's lip twitched. Bah. Leave me alone. I need to rest. Yes. You can rest, just give me a rundown of what's been happening. Skip anything too unseemly. I don't want images of my son's poor performance in bed running through my mind. I have enough bullshit to deal with. Aina suddenly wanted to find a hole to bury herself in. Couldn't this man be more subtle? Where was the sense of propriety? Her face became like a shimmering lantern of red. She fixed her gaze to the floor, biting her lip. Val's gaze went blank for a moment as a subtle pulse of energy wafted out from the segmented cube. But, just as quickly he snapped back to reality. I see. Alright, easy fix then. Anastasia, siphon away some of my strength. Make a barrier of about level 2 strength around lab 1. Fine. Val flicked a finger and the segmented cube zipped back onto Lionel's finger. Finally, he looked at Aina. You want to fix him, right? Simple. When he wakes up, tell him that he can forget about his little king role-playing game until he can break that barrier. Oh, and tell him that I have enough power in a single cell to shatter that barrier 10 times over. Val waved a hand and strode away, his laughter causing the rapak's nest to quake. A king? What a joke. Your old man's still alive. At best, you can be a little prince. Chapter 1348. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 41 seconds p.m. Chapter 1348, just like. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1348, just like. Lionel shot up, his forehead almost banging against Ana's. But, in a final moment, he managed to come to a grinding halt, suddenly finding that the control he had over his body had reached a truly exaggerated degree. For a moment, their noses were barely a millimeter apart, their gazes locking. Even with the terrible scent hanging in the air, Lionel almost became too keenly aware of Ana's own delicate fragrance by contrast. He had no idea how she managed to not latch onto the stink the rest of this place had, but maybe he should never challenge a woman's ability to remain clean. Lionel's expression flickered, his mind suddenly running through everything it had been through in just the last several minutes. His brows furrowed. He had more control over himself now, but he didn't quite know how he should be reacting. His instinct was just to shut it all down again. Seeing Lionel's expression growing colder, Ana suddenly spoke. Your father said. Ana repeated everything Val had said verbatim, not holding back. She thought about taking the edge off of the words, but in the end, she decided against it. She thought that with the relationship Lionel had with his father, maybe the rawest form of what he had said was exactly what Lionel needed to hear. Lionel was astonished, not knowing what to say for a long time. My dad was here? Lionel blinked as Ana nodded. He sent his mind into the segmented cube and he did indeed find that Lab 1 was surrounded from all sides by a barrier. Even without trying, he knew that he didn't have a single chance at even cracking it, a calculation that he was surprised his mind could even accomplish, let alone complete so quickly. Lionel seemed to get the message loud and clear. This was how large the gap between him and the peak of the dimensional verse was. No, this couldn't even be considered the peak of the verse at all. At best, it could be considered the pinnacle of the middle tiers. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. In truth, Lionel didn't need to hear this at all. Just the information that his dad had been here was enough to paint the picture. To be able to so casually enter a Rapak's nest then leave as he pleased without a word. Well, it all spoke for itself. Lionel suddenly smiled, his gaze lighting up. Ana was completely caught off guard by this. She couldn't truly understand. The words Lionel's father had spoken might seem benign from a certain perspective, but from another. They were the kind of words Lionel would hate to hear the most. She had come to learn of what her mistakes were in the past. She didn't give Lionel the support he needed even though he had always been there for her. This was why she had resolved that no matter what happened between now and the future, she would always be here. Her fighting it out with Lionel didn't mean she had already given up on this. It was just her way of showing that she had no intention of giving up on him. Maybe it wasn't the perfect method, but they were ultimately still young and she had spent most of her life without a normal range of emotion. It had been the only way she could think of to force Lionel to see her perspective. Ironically, though, it had ended up being her words that triggered all of this, but that only made it all the more baffling. Everything about Val's words had been a culmination of everything Lionel hated. His father's words had doubted him, belittled him, and even put him in his place without care or reserve for his face. So, why was it that Lionel was grinning and laughing? Ana hadn't been nearly as harsh when she said similar things. She had only warned Lionel that the dimensional verse wasn't the kind of place that could be underestimated. She didn't want him to put his life on the line just for the sake of saving people he didn't even know. She wanted him to stay by her side, safe. It was then that it seemed to click for Ana. The love that Lionel had for his father made what he might feel for her feel small and meaningless. There was maybe no one in his life and Lionel respected and adored more than his father. She had thought that because of how Lionel had practically worshipped the ground she walked on, that she could speak more freely than 99% of people in his life while in his presence. In a certain respect, she wasn't wrong. But, it was always a matter of relativity. The things that Val could say to Lionel weren't the sort of things that she could get away with saying. At that moment, Aina came to understand. Lionel had put a lot of effort into winning her heart, years, even. By this point, she would be lying if she said that she cared for anyone more than she cared for him. In fact, Lionel and her father held equal weight in her heart. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net maybe that was because her relationship with her father wasn't nearly as good as the one Lionel shared with his own, but there was a certain level of love that blood ties could form that other forms of love otherwise couldn't. And yet, Lionel had managed to reach that level for her, while she had yet to reach that level for him. The truth was very simple. Despite his smile and charisma, Lionel was arrogant to his very bones. He had a relentless drive to win, he felt his opinion was more likely than not the right way to go, and he felt that questioning and doubting him were things most people simply didn't have the right to do. Even Aina, herself. However, his father was very different. If there was one man that was his better, that had the right to question him, to doubt him, that might very well have an opinion that was superior to his own, it was Velasco Morales. A challenge from anyone else made Lionel turn his nose up. A challenge from his father, though, stoked the flames in his heart and made his gaze light up with ruthless ambition. Much like the day Lionel began to learn to craft, this time was not much different. Just a prince? Okay, for now I'll just be a prince until I can kick your ass, old man. Lionel's skin reddened, his veins pulsing with a dense reddish gold. A singular rune floated within each one of his irises, his blood rushing throughout his body. In that moment, he became keenly aware of just how close Aina's nose was to his own. His fiery gaze met hers, his elevated heartbeat seeming to resonate between them. Aina's skin flushed red, looking away and pulling back slightly. Something about Lionel's eyes made her feel like a deer in headlights. But it was precisely because she did this that she didn't react in time to a pair of lips pressing onto her own. Somehow, it felt just like the first time. Chapter 1349. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 1349. Explain in words if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1349. Explain in words. An explosion went off in Aina's mind. Of all the things she thought would happen today, this was the very last. For a moment, she couldn't sense anything else but the sensation on her lips. Her heart fluttered, her blood ran hot, and her lower belly pulsed with an odd feeling she would have trouble putting into words. Her weight subconsciously fell onto Lionel, her palm pressing to his chest and her lips weighing heavier on his as though to fuse with him. With how Lionel had sat up and how she kneeled on both legs, the shift in balance wasn't a lot, but it was usually more than enough to force someone else to waver. And yet, Lionel's body was like a sturdy wall, not shifting in the slightest even as Aina leaned into him. Little Blackstar, who had fallen into complete silence the moment Velasco had appeared, tilted his little head to the side. Even with all the emotional intelligence in the world, the little mink was ultimately still a child, and this situation was confusing nonetheless. They had gone from Lionel playing the part of valiant hero, to Aina unleashing a barrage of punches and kicks at his expense, to Lionel nearly dying, then to Aina meeting a man she was incredibly nervous around, then to Lionel being insulted maybe worse than he ever had in his entire life, all to end in a kiss. When Aina's foggy mind cleared and the reality of it all snapped into place, she pulled back quickly, her palm leaving Lionel's chest and becoming a fist that pressed into her own. She breathed heavily and erratically, her mind all over the place and her body flushed red. Aina didn't seem to want to look Lionel in the eye. There was something about this that felt wrong. She was one part happy, another part apprehensive, and a large part confused about how she should be feeling. It felt good. It felt really good. Even if she had never experienced it with someone else, something in her intuition told her that Lionel was the only one who could possibly make her body feel like this with what amounted to a simple peck on the lip. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. He hadn't touched her body, he hadn't used his tongue, he hadn't even used any great pressure or coercion. In fact, it was she who had found herself leaning heavily into him as though wanting for more. And yet, she felt like she had flown to another world for a moment. "Why did you do that?" Aina asked softly. The happiness came too quickly. In one moment, she was made keenly aware that she lacked true stature in Lionel's heart, and in the next, he was making her feel as though she was riding on a cloud. She felt that in one part she should be angry, and she even somewhat felt used, but she still couldn't bring herself to feel that way. "Because I really wanted to," Lionel said as though it was just a matter of fact. And, maybe it was to him, but that didn't answer any of Aina's question. "That's not an answer, isn't it?" Lionel smiled. Aina's heart began to beat wildly again. Lionel's words were definitely not always like this. At the very least, he couldn't always make her hang on to his every word like this. The Lionel she remembered was charming, but he also had a streak of boyish innocence and naivete to him. This Lionel felt more forceful and determined. Was this the change brought about by his goal? If Aina was honest, she hadn't spent enough time with Lionel post his decision to pick up on this change. It might have also been because she had spent most of that time trying to get him to change his mind about said goal. However, there was no denying that this Lionel held an even more lethal attraction to her, one that was far more difficult to ignore. It awoke a bit of her masochistic tendencies, something the previous Lionel had entirely failed to pick up on, but this Lionel would likely be far more in tune to. Aina was both frightened and excited by this prospect. But, after a moment, she took a deep breath and calmed. After a second deep breath, she had returned to her baseline, her flushed skin receding and her gaze finally meeting Lionel's. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net, explain it to me, in real words. Aina said gently. Lionel blinked and thought for a moment. You're a distraction. I can't focus on the task at hand or make harsh and necessary decisions when you're around. In the time we weren't together, my progress was far faster than anything I've ever experienced. However, it's become more difficult to ignore you than I thought. My mind ends up wasting its potential power output by diverting some of its attention to suppressing and locking away emotions I would otherwise feel. But, I've gotten way too ahead of myself. My dad is right, if he's alive, at best I can be a prince. There are certain burdens I shouldn't be taking on right now, burdens that would ultimately have the opposing effect to what I want. Instead of helping me in the future, it will instead slow my progress now. Since that's the case, there are certain things that aren't worth it. Treating you like a subordinate instead of my queen, for example, is one. It's objectively a foolish waste of time that would, theoretically, help me to stay focused and keep an eye on the future. But, in the short term, it strains our relationship unnecessarily, while in the long term, no human has an infinite amount of patience. Even if you are determined to stay by my side now, it's impossible to tell if you'll still feel that way in 10 years, or 20 years, or more time than even that. And, if I keep you by my side during all that time, while insisting to not cross certain barriers, it only makes the day you eventually snap and give up all the more devastating because you would have been such an important and ingrained foundational pillar of all I had built until that point. Given that, just shut up and kiss me again. Aina's lips stifled what would have been the rest of Lionel's explanation. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1350. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1350. Weird Mind. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1350. Weird Mind. Aina had realized something very important. The weight of Velasco's words, to Lionel, weighed more than anything else. If Aina had known what Velasco had said to Lionel months ago, she would have realized even more so how true those words were. Listen kid, I always told you women were complicated. You spent 4 years chasing after that little girl, she probably thinks you'll always be there for her whenever it is she wants to come back. They were a sprawl of words randomly thrown into what was assuredly another prank, but Lionel seemed to have latched onto them. It made it far easier for him to draw a line in the sand and maybe was part of the reason he had been so callous to Aina's words that day. It could be said that if there was anything Aina was certain of now, it was that Lionel wouldn't always be waiting for her. He hadn't come to stop her wedding, he hadn't been the catalyst who saved her, he hadn't even checked up on her afterward, and it all culminated in maybe the greatest heartbreak she had ever experienced in her lifetime. However, Aina was very determined about one thing. She didn't know how long it would take, she didn't know what she would have to do, but she would definitely one day be able to say words to Lionel that weighed just as heavily as his father's did. To her, this wasn't a matter of competition, but rather a reminder that she still had efforts to be made. The reality was that she didn't like Lionel bluntly breaking down their relationship into gains and losses, benefits and pitfalls. She hated it so much that while Lionel had been following her request to explain it in clear words, she had to fight back the will to punch him in the face, again. This was the reason why she had stopped him despite him doing exactly what she had asked for. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. However, she understood that this was truly how Lionel saw things, even if she couldn't quite understand. Maybe his method of courting her in the past, his perpetual smile, his following her every step and action, had never really been him. That Lionel was always the version of himself he had thought she would want. It was the very same naive stage every young man went through, chasing after the woman of their dreams. They made the very false assumption that the best course of action to take was to simply comply with all of her wishes. She would definitely like you then. Unfortunately, this couldn't have been further from the truth. Of course, Lionel hadn't taken such action to an exaggerated degree. But he had most definitely let Aina mold many of his thoughts and tendencies, even to the point it only took him a few days by her side to ignore how much he hated the way she viewed killing. As Lionel grew, though, his own thoughts and opinions solidified and the way he viewed the world had subtly changed. He was still the same Lionel, but he was far more assertive. It was hard to say that he had truly matured, but he was definitely more of an adult. Aina thus understood that much of Lionel's infatuation had only been surface level and she could only be said to have a place in his heart, but she didn't own it. Everyone had a small bit of selfishness in their heart. Aina simply wanted Lionel to love her as much as she loved him. Nothing more, nothing less. Yip. Yip. Little Blackstar happily chirped, but also seemed to remind the two that they were still deep within enemy territory. Aina had already found herself straddling Lionel when Blackstar's call made her blush. The little mink was right, they were technically in a very dangerous situation right now. She had been a small measure away from asking Lionel if he had a condom again. But, with her better judgment, she decided that she definitely didn't want to have her first time in this place. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel's head turned in a certain direction. It took several moments, so long, in fact, that Aina thought that he was mistaken. But, after about half a minute, her gaze, too, sharpened. "It's fine," Lionel said. "They're humans." As soon as Lionel said these words, a group of 3 rushed out of the dense black fog. They all looked to be in terrible shape, not a single one being without a devastating injury of some sort. In fact, it could be said that they would have already died if not for a certain event causing the Rapax they had been fighting to rush off. There didn't seem to be a decisive leader amongst the 3, while one was a woman and the other 2 were men. Lionel couldn't recognize them, so it was likely that their foggy lake hadn't been the only one. But, he had to think, just how big was the Rapax nest for them to send them all in here? With all the sectors there were, and there being at least 3 golden tokens to each, there had to be many that qualified for this trial. When they 3 spotted Lionel and Aina, though, their lips couldn't help but twitch. Lionel's back was reclined against a wall as he sat on the ground. Aina, though, had straddled his waist, placing both palms on his chest. Even though they both had serious expressions on now, there was no doubt about what they must have been doing before, especially since Aina's short beast-skin skirt threatened to roll up her thigh and past her bottom. The 2 young men couldn't help but gulp, causing Lionel to raise an eyebrow. Seeing this, Aina almost couldn't help but giggle. Like the flip of a switch, Lionel had gone from not caring if she got married to someone else to suddenly being prickled by looks that ultimately couldn't see anything anyway. She was suddenly fascinated by how Lionel's mind worked. Chapter 1351. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 36 seconds p.m. Chapter 1351, Be Good. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1351, Be Good. Lionel and Aina rose from the ground. Surprisingly, the both of them didn't seem to care much about the precarious situation they had been in. Aina simply picked up her enormous axe as though nothing had happened. Yip! Yip! Little black star dove into Aina's chest, causing her to smile. It seemed that little guy was even more excited than she was. But, of course he was, he had finally gotten his favorite bed back. The three youths frowned. They were suddenly acutely aware that Lionel and Aina weren't injured in the slightest. Lionel's bruises and lumps had already healed along with his cracked ribs. Aside from a small bit of dried blood that touched his body here and there was nothing else. As for Aina, she was even less injured, having been stowed away for their only major fight, a bone she had yet to finish picking with Lionel. Lionel looked over the three youths. In truth, he had no intention of taking on burdens, and it would be more difficult to avoid detection if he took 3 people with him. But he also wouldn't feel right if he simply allowed 3 people he could have helped die. "We're close to the exit," Lionel said with a smile, and that was all he said. He had realized already that the method he and Aina had been taking was correct. They ruined Raypax hadn't been luring them incorrectly, but it was rather a problem of the fact a Raypax would obviously be more familiar with their nest than Lionel could possibly be. So, when the ruined Raypax realized what they must want to do, cutting them off before they could reach their goal was child's play. Luckily, this meant that they were still near the entrance, or rather exit, nonetheless. However, whether it was safe passage to take or not was a different matter entirely. Lionel turned and began to walk away with Aina by his side. The trio looked at one another, frowning. They weren't sure if Lionel's words were true. They had only come to this place because they were running away. They hadn't been paying attention to where they were going. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The lack of injuries on the pair and their nonchalance seemed to scream that they were powerful. But was it really possible to leave this nest without so much as an injury? They were all absolute geniuses in their own right. They didn't believe that the gap between them and someone else could possibly be so wide. So, could it just be that they had gotten lucky and didn't come across any enemies? Forget it, it doesn't matter. We have no idea where we're going anyway and would have to just randomly pick a direction. We might as well see if they're right about the exit. One of them spoke. Lionel didn't look back when he felt them being followed. He had already done his part. Whether they chose to follow him or not had nothing to do with him any longer at that point. As Lionel had expected, after splitting down just one more tunnel, the wind shifted and the air became slightly cleaner. After traveling several hundred more meters, Lionel came to the edge of a corner and came to a grinding halt. Aina stopped right behind him and little Black Star grew quiet. Following their lead, the three also came to a pause. Lionel closed his eyes, his brows furrowing. There was nothing there. No guards, no sentries, nothing. He couldn't sense any force arts, no traps, and even the flow of force didn't have anything wrong with it. There wasn't even something as simple as a door, it was just opened wide to the expanse of what Lionel assumed was the void battlefield. No, there's something odd there. Lionel's brows shot up and he suddenly understood. This path sloped upward, going from deep underground to above it and forming the whole of an exit/entrance. However, on the opposite side, there was actually another entrance. It wasn't just that, there were entrances surrounding this one entirely. And, beyond that, there were enormous domes riddled with holes that Lionel was fairly certain were likely the very same holes they had been looking up through earlier. There was definitely a 300-meter drop on the other side of them. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net shit. Lionel's gaze narrowed. This wasn't just a Raypax nest. It was a field of Raypax nests. If they wanted to get out of here, they would need to somehow navigate through them all until they could find a nest on the edge to escape. Lionel was suddenly annoyed by his dad. The old man couldn't have said a single word about this. He could have at least pointed out a direction. But, as things stood now, Lionel was truly uncertain of which way to go. Even though he had noticed that his senses had actually greatly improved, it still wasn't enough to cover an entire network of nests, especially when just one was so large already. On top of that, for the same reasons as before, traveling above ground definitely wasn't an option, at least not long term. It was fine if this exit didn't have guards because each nest essentially fed into one another. However, Lionel was still certain that there were many keeping an eye on the above-ground holes, or else the Raypaks would be far too easy to infiltrate. We have to take a risk. We can't just blindly choose a direction and hope for the best. I need to fly high enough into the sky to see which way is the shortest to safety. So long as I can lock onto that direction, even while stuck beneath the ground, they'll be able to stay true to it. But, I need the direction first. Lionel took a deep breath, his gaze stealing. Then, he took a long stride forward. But, just before he could do as he planned, he suddenly felt a strong force grab onto his wrist and yank him backward. Lionel looked back to find a glaring Aina. No, you don't. You're going to be a good boyfriend and tell me exactly what you're planning. Then we'll see if I should get involved or not. Lionel's lip twitched. The three youths to their backs looked toward one another, not sure of how to react. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1352. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 35 seconds p.m. Chapter 1352. Trust if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1352. Trust. Lionel sighed. Alright. The exit is around the corner but there's nothing guarding it. And? Aina asked. She was smart enough to know that this was definitely not a good thing. Different species aside, the Raypaks were clearly intelligent. They wouldn't make such a rudimentary mistake. There's nothing guarding it because they don't need to guard it, at least not this exit in particular. We're currently surrounded by 3 other identical entrances that lead to other hives identical to this one. In fact, we're in a field of nests right now and my internal sight doesn't spread far enough to tell if we're nearer the middle, an edge, or what direction we should go in. The expressions of the 3 youths sunk when they heard this. They had thought that they were close to at least leaping over this first hurdle, but there was actually so much more to go. Who had set up this selection? Did they want them all to die? So you want to fly up and check which direction to go. Aina finished. There's no real other choice. Of course there's another choice. You could make an image probe to check for you. If that doesn't work, there's Blackstar. His stealth is much higher than any of our own. He could probably do it without risking being found out at all. An image probe would require materials and a force art that wouldn't be eroded by anarchic force, neither of which I have on hands right now. As for Blackstar, that is a more legitimate possibility, but I don't like it. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed, so it comes down to you being stubborn again. It isn't stubbornness, just efficiency. There's no amount of stealth that will help little Blackstar hide himself in the air. It's just relativity. Blackstar is far smaller than any one of us and also has the best evasive maneuvers. At the same time, the Raypaks likely know that there's a bunch of humans running around in their territory by now. They might not be ready to spot a little mink. And, on top of that, can't little Blackstar change form as well? If it comes down to it, it might be worth exploring the possibility of using that to our advantage. I just think it's still better if I go. You aren't explaining. It's hard to explain. It isn't. I know why you want to go. For one, you don't want to put Blackstar in danger. And, secondly, you trust in your ability to react to unforeseen circumstances far more than anyone else. You're just reluctant to say so because it proves my point. Lionel opened his mouth to respond but suddenly found that he had nothing to say. Little Blackstar's head bobbed back and forth between them as the two argued, if it could even be called that. He seemed very curious about how this would end and even seemed amused about how Aina had cornered Lionel. Whenever Lionel made an assessment, there were two things he always took into consideration. The first was what the situation was at face value, and the second was what the situation had a chance of mutating and warping into. The first was straightforward enough, however the more likely the second was to cause his analysis to veer off path, the more likely it was that he would rather take on the burden himself. In Lionel's opinion, there was simply no one who could adapt to a change faster than he could. In fact, one of the only people to ever impress him with their adaptation ability, Emna Baysiran from Crimson Hall, was a woman he almost immediately invited to become one of his generals. To this day, she had still been the only person he had ever tried to recruit like that. Sometimes he still lamented that he didn't manage to win her over. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net these were the two forces tugging at Lionel's mind. And the truth was that even if Emna was here, he would still trust himself hundreds of times more. That was just how he was. He liked to cut out variables as much as possible, even way back to the final game he and James had played together. Thinking to this point, Lionel closed his eyes and took a breath. When he opened them again, he rubbed his thumb on Blackstar's small little head. "Ready, little guy?" "Yip. Yip." Blackstar excitedly bounded into the air, flipping and vanishing into the fog before appearing around the corner. Aina smiled, but inwardly her heart was beating wildly. She felt that this was the right decision, but if things went poorly, it would become even more difficult for Lionel to make this choice again in the future. In a lot of ways, Lionel was right. He was able to adapt faster and better than most. The reason he was so confident that he could defeat people as strong as Aina despite being weaker was because raw strength wasn't his greatest asset, his mind was. Lionel had had no business defeating six-dimensional experts as a mere Tier 1 existence, and yet he had done so. That kind of confidence, that kind of bone-deep and unflappable poise in the face of terrible odds was all too rare. However, Aina also knew that if Lionel didn't learn how to trust that others could accomplish good as well, even if they weren't as great as him, his dreams wouldn't be able to progress very far. There was only so much a single person could accomplish. Aina looked toward Lionel's side profile, but he was already extremely focused. His gaze had frosted over, his expression had become unreadable, and an oppressive aura began to weigh down on the surroundings, suddenly making it difficult for the three youths behind them to breathe. Little Blackstar shot out of the exit like a beam of black light, then performed a sharp 90-degree turn upward, flying into the skies. Lionel could feel his partner's excitement through their connection. Chapter 1353. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 34 seconds p.m. Chapter 1353. Shadow World. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1353. Shadow World. Little Blackstar's speed was extraordinary. With the inherent darkness of the void battlefield and the black fog that hung over everything, Aina had indeed been correct about the little mink's stealth ability. However, there was another reason that Lionel had chosen to go with Aina's suggestions, and that was because of the problem of visibility. While it seemed like a good idea to get higher ground and see further, there was one important matter that had to be considered, and that was the fog. Even back on Void Palace grounds, Lionel could hardly see a few meters ahead of himself, and this was fairly similar for everyone else as well. Lionel wasn't convinced that the void battlefield would be much better. In fact, it was likely that it would be even worse. Lionel had planned to circumvent this potential issue using an internal sight manipulation technique. By changing the form of his internal sight, he could gain more range in a straight line simply by rearranging how he allocated its volume. With the sudden increase to his mind strength, Lionel had been confident that he could do this. Of course, this came with a great risk. Internal sight was just another form of manipulating force, and it could be sensed by those sensitive to it, especially those of higher dimensions. It was possible that Rapax would be less sharp about such things considering their immunity, but it was also just as likely that they'd be hypersensitive, as seen by the first Rapax Lionel had fought after coming to this nest. That particular Rapax, due to Lionel's loose use of his internal sight, had already sensed him before he even rounded the corner. It was because of this that Lionel wasn't confident in avoiding detection using the fog, which was why he wanted to be the one to personally take on the burden. This aside, little Blackstar didn't have such an ability. He hadn't learned the technique Lionel had, nor did he have great use of internal sight. It was odd, but Lionel couldn't remember little Blackstar ever using internal sight at all. However, what little Blackstar could do was something else. The little mink was a shadow sovereign and had access to the shadow world. The shadow world was considered to be a mirror of their current world, one where shadows reigned supreme. Whenever it was that little Blackstar became immune to outside attacks, it was because the little one had shifted his physical state into his shadow world. And, whenever little Blackstar teleported, what was actually happening was him shifting to his shadow world then popping back out. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. It had taken Lionel a very long time to construct the ins and outs of this ability because little Blackstar couldn't communicate via conventional means, but he believed that he had some understanding of it now. Without getting overly lost in the details, Lionel had commanded little Blackstar to shoot into the air as high as he could. Once he was in position, he would shift into his shadow world. While within his shadow world, little Blackstar was essentially on a very short timer. Although being within the shadow world gave little Blackstar a great amount of control, it was also a great burden on the little guy. This was why little Blackstar never blinked away for too long. The little mink had 3 states. One where he was fully within the real world. A second where his image was in the real world and his physical form was in the shadow world. And the third was one where his entire being was in the shadow world. Staying in the first and second state were relatively easier. However, to take full advantage of the shadow world, little Blackstar needed to enter the third state. The shadow world was shared by shadow sovereigns. As they moved about in the real world, so too would they shift within the shadow world. Whenever a shadow sovereign entered battle, that location of the shadow world they were in, the mirror image of their location in the real world, would effectively become their domain. Within this domain, the shadow sovereign would gain control over all sorts of abilities. But, what little Blackstar used the most often was folding space. This was why the little mink could move so fast. By shifting into the shadow world, Blackstar could fold reality to his whims and teleport. This even allowed him to do what Aina couldn't and leave and enter the segmented cube at will. However, this wasn't what Lionel wanted little Blackstar to do this time. By having control over a domain you would, by proxy, know every single little detail about that domain. Knowing this, Lionel's goal was obvious. He wanted little Blackstar to enter the shadow world and push the bounds of his domain as far as possible. In doing so, the little mink would gain a perfect understanding of everything within his domain in the blink of an eye, albeit for just a very small moment. This leads to an obvious question: why risk little Blackstar like this, then? Couldn't this same thing be accomplished within the tunnels? And the unfortunate truth was no. Little Blackstar had a hard enough time expanding his domain in the shadow world already without having to worry about thick barriers of wall infused and tempered with anarchic force over countless generations. Simply put, Blackstar's attempts would end up being stalled before he even got the chance. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel didn't want little Blackstar to waste time trying to map out the tunnels. Instead, he wanted a perfect aerial view of the network of hives. After that, everything else could be left up to him. Little Blackstar reached his apex height, his little body suddenly vanishing into a blackness. Almost instantaneously, several powerful auras swept over, sensing something amiss. However, they just barely missed little Blackstar entirely, ending up snagging their senses at empty air. Within the shadow world, a perfect replica of their world reflected in little Blackstar's eyes, but the range was too small to see everything. However, the good news was that in his domain, even the fog couldn't obstruct little Blackstar's vision any longer. The little guy had never tried to push the barriers before, but this time, he would go all out. Little Blackstar's long whiskers twitched, his hair standing on end and his body seeming to expand by twice its original size. Bang! Little Blackstar's domain grew explosively. Yip! A violent shudder suddenly shook the little mink's body, a ripple of pain coursing through his mind. Within the tunnels, Lionel's frosty gaze dropped several more levels of temperature. There's a second shadow sovereign in this place. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1354. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 33 seconds p.m. Chapter 1354. Smoldering. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1354. Smoldering. Lionel wasn't infuriated because there was a second shadow sovereign. From the very beginning, he had been aware that there was more than one. In fact, he knew a second one in Mordred. When he first learned about shadow sovereigns from Uncle Montez, he had introduced it in a way that Lionel knew from then that there would always be more than one. Without a doubt, the true reason Lionel was pissed was because little Blackstar had been hurt. It wasn't a devastating injury, but it was definitely one the little mink would need some time to recover from. Lionel had always treated little Blackstar like a little brother, a child that was still growing up. This was why he rarely if ever used little Blackstar in battle, even if the little one was a powerful warrior. Lionel had no doubt that compared to these geniuses of the Void Palace, little Blackstar was no worse. However, he was still reluctant to truly let him loose. And now, his little brother had been harmed. How could he not be infuriated? The shadow world was shared by shadow sovereigns. Under most situations, this wasn't a problem as they were rare beings to begin with. However, in the case that two shadow sovereigns did meet on the same battlefield, Lionel hadn't known exactly what would happen, until now. The clash of domains had caused a strong backlash and harmed little Blackstar. In fact, Lionel could feel the malicious intent that converged on the tail end of the interaction. Little Blackstar had tried to envelop the network of hives with his domain from above. But, this being the first time the little one had tried to do such a thing, he hadn't been prepared for the possibility of running into another domain. Yip! Little Blackstar fell from the skies. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Lionel had already moved, rounding the corner and catching little Blackstar from the air. His expression was as dark as could be. Little Blackstar's small eyes were tightly closed, a hint of blood trickling from his nose. He trembled as though he had just been plunged into freezing waters. Lionel cradled the little mink in his arms, his snow force reaching out and caressing him from head to toe. It was only after this that Blackstar showed the slightest hints of relief, however the smoldering fury in Lionel's gaze only seemed to grow hotter. In those moments, had little Blackstar not retreated beneath his command fast enough, the result could have been devastating. A shadow world was tied to something intrinsic within a shadow sovereign, and the loss of it was equivalent to the loss of a life. He had been that close to losing his partner of so many years. Lionel? Ana's voice came from his side. To her, this was the worst-case scenario. Even though she knew that this was the best course of action to take and that her logic had been sound, it was simply human nature to feel terrible. If she hadn't said anything, this wouldn't have happened. But, then again, the person to suffer would have likely been Lionel instead. It's not your fault. Lionel said softly. It's mine. I've sheltered him too much. He has no idea how to deal with situations where the enemy isn't a ridiculous amount weaker than him. Ana's gaze flickered. Lionel's words were sound, but they had a biting cold to them that he couldn't seem to retrieve just yet. Despite the fact they were standing out in the open of the void battlefield, he made no movement to retrieve as though he was begging someone to come. No, I'm sorry. I should have taken that into account as well. Ana shook her head. Lionel didn't reply, but he truthfully didn't blame Ana. Judging a decision by only its result and nothing else was foolish, and it wasn't the kind of logic Lionel would prescribe to. However, that wouldn't stop him from feeling like this. He stroked little Blackstar's head, hoping to soothe the little mink just the slightest bit more. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. What happened? Ana asked. Blackstar's shadow domain clashed with another shadow sovereign's domain. He wasn't ready for the backlash and now he's hurt. The three youths, hearing the term shadow sovereign, froze. That little beast was a shadow sovereign? The mixture of jealousy, apprehension, and darker thoughts was almost immediate. However, the heavy atmosphere around Lionel seemed to snap them out of such thoughts. They weren't fools. That sort of oppression wasn't normal and should even come from a rare type of ability. The number of families they could think of that had such abilities was all too small, and each one of them was from astounding families. They had great backgrounds themselves, as did pretty much everyone in the Void Palace. But there were still levels and degrees of separation to be found everywhere. Then it's a failure? Aina asked. No. It wasn't a failure. Lionel explained. The domain of the second Shadow Sovereign was just a small point toward the center of the hive. For whatever reason, they had shrunk down their domain to an incredibly small degree, at least in comparison to what their true abilities should be. It's likely that there are other reasons for this. Regardless, Little Blackstar managed to find us several points toward a true exit. Lionel explained all of this calmly and evenly, his voice not wavering in the slightest. Everything about his demeanor was steady. However, Aina could almost feel his fury. Although it had just been for a few split seconds, Lionel had already memorized the images Blackstar had shared to him perfectly without missing even a single detail. He knew the location of a true exit, what could be found there, and he also knew the exact locations of every entrance in a section of the network. That Shadow Sovereign likely knows we're here then. Aina concluded. Yes. They will know that we're located somewhere within the range of Little Blackstar's domain. But, I truly hope they come. Lionel's hair danced lightly in the air, a smoldering crimson flickering in his irises. Chapter 1355. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1355. Come again? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1355. Come again? Aina didn't say anything toward Lionel's words. But, seeing the state Little Blackstar was in, her expression, too, turned cold. She had been too wrapped up in her initial guilt to feel the same rage Lionel did. But, after that faded, it wasn't a surprise that she didn't feel too differently. However, for the three listening to this conversation, they felt like they were listening to an insane pair of people. You wanted to meet a Shadow Sovereign? Excuse me? Just judging by the state Little Blackstar was in, this Shadow Sovereign was most likely at least within the 6th dimension, if not higher. The fact they had deployed their shadow domain here also likely meant that they were a Rapax. It had to be understood that Rapax with non-physical type ability indexes were extraordinarily rare. Often, they were taken to be cripples by their race. However, there were a small percentage of this already rare contingent that were seen as even more valuable than those with the most powerful physical type ability indexes. In this case, a Shadow Sovereign would most definitely be among this number. This meant that this Rapax wasn't just a ruined Rapax, it was definitely an elite amongst ruined Rapax and would be treated as such. But, this was just the tip of the iceberg. That was because there was a hidden struggle between Shadow Sovereigns that only involved them. Each Shadow Sovereign was a unique sort of existence, but it was also very difficult for them to improve as a result. However, swallowing another Shadow Sovereign's domain was an easy shortcut to this sort of improvement. It wasn't a matter of if this Shadow Sovereign was coming, it was a matter of when. With Little Blackstar in such a vulnerable position, he was practically easy food. The fact that Little Blackstar was a beast only made it all the more enticing because his beast crystal could be taken and swallowed as well, allowing the Rapax to benefit twice over. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. They should be running for their lives, not standing menacingly out in the open as though they couldn't wait for confrontation. That was suicide. The middle young man finally couldn't seem to take it anymore and stepped forward. Listen, I know exactly how my words are going to come off as, but I don't care. Our lives are on the line here. It's fine if you want to stay and get revenge for your beast companion, but we can't risk our lives along with you. If you could tell us which direction is closest to the exit, I would greatly appreciate it. The young man was known as Ogre. He tried to choose an approach that was respectful, but also forceful in what he was asking. He didn't want this to devolve into a battle, but if it had to, he was ready nonetheless. He had no will to risk his life for the sake of a little beast he had just met. At the same time, he knew that he had no right to ask for information this very same little beast had risked its life to get. However, without this information, he didn't believe he could survive. Towards such ends, he could only choose the path of the hypocrite. No one would care about this in 10 years when he was alive and these two were dead. However, what Ogre hadn't expected was that direction. You can go now. Lionel pointed straight between two of the entrances and toward an expanse of fog. He didn't particularly care whether these people stayed with them or not. And the truth was that he hadn't wanted to take them along to begin with. The only reason he had was because of his conscience. However, since they wanted to go, he wouldn't stop them. Ogre froze. He opened his mouth to say thank you, but then he suddenly thought of a large problem. What if he was lying? His heart began to beat out of his chest. Technically, they were all still in competition, right? What if Lionel wanted a convenient method of dealing with them? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Ogre didn't know what to say or do for a very long time. He couldn't even think of a way to ensure that this was the truth. Are you lying to us? The only young woman of the three stepped forward, her brows knit into a frown. Roxanne, we need to ask. If he's sending us off to our deaths out of spite, then wouldn't we be dying for nothing? It's true that he doesn't owe us anything, but that wouldn't give him the right to screw us over, right? The last of the three stepped forward, realizing that there was only one side of this issue that he could stand upon. If he didn't side with Roxanne and Ogre, he would have no way of confirming his own safety as well. Lionel met the momentum of the three across from him with a deadpan expression. Quite frankly, he wasn't in the mood, not at all. This was the absolute worst time for anyone to antagonize him. He was very close to attacking and leaving them here to rot in their own foolishness. Even though he could understand where they were coming from, he simply didn't have the patience for it. The fact they had run into him in the first place was already a blessing for them, but it seemed that they hadn't realized this. Even their previous battle had only ended because his father had scared the Rapax they were fighting away. How exactly do you expect us to prove this to you? Surprisingly, it was Aina who spoke instead, her expression frosting over as her battle axe vibrated. There's a simple solution. You seem to care about your beast partner and it's in far too injured a state to help you in battle regardless. Give it to us and we'll follow your directions. That way we'll be rest assured in the fact you aren't lying to us. Roxanne had hardly finished her words when she felt her knees go weak. Come again? Aina asked coldly. Chapter 1356. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 30 seconds p.m. Chapter 1356. Bully, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1356. Bully, it was oh so very convenient. The logic was sound and there was nothing wrong with it in a perfectly neutral sort of sense. Taking little Blackstar with them would definitely guarantee that it would be in Lionel's best interest not to lie to them. After all, he cared about his beast companion surviving, right? It was clever. However, it was from that point that everything else collapsed. Lionel owed these people nothing. Why would he leave his little brother with three individuals he had just as little trust in as they did him? On top of that, just because he hadn't said anything about it, didn't mean that Lionel didn't notice their shift in demeanor when learning that Blackstar was a shadow sovereign. Just how convenient was this? They got to force Lionel to hand over someone dear to him, and in their minds, he would likely die seeking revenge, and then they would get a convenient and very valuable beast to use or sell in the future. Was there anything in the world that could be so good? If it wasn't for Aina stepping forward first, Lionel would have likely already lashed out, his smoldering fury bubbling over to deal with these three before he met the thing that had put his little brother in such a state. I'll give you all 3 seconds to get the fuck out of my sight, or I'll make it so that you can't even if you want to. Aina's aura pressed down on them from above, and it suddenly became obvious why she was the only one who seemed completely unmoved by Lionel's own every time. You. Roxanne's brows jumped, but the fiery glow of Aina's golden eyes seemed to suppress her impulse to react before it could even manifest. A menacing darkness loomed overhead and Aina's canines grew as delicate black patterns ran over her skin. The oppression seemed to triple in an instant, only growing with every passing moment that went by. Lionel's gaze shifted from the three before them to the intricate tattoos forming on Aina's toned back. They followed her curves and gave her a bestial sort of aura that was highly enticing. Abyssal Panther, Lionel had almost forgotten that Aina had gained this treasure from terrain and most importantly, had forgotten exactly what that meant and represented. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. It wasn't entirely Lionel's fault. He hadn't been there when Aina first unchained herself from her curse and City Lord White had called her a Blood Sovereign. Lionel was still ignorant to this, or even what such a title even meant. But, what he did know were two things. First, Aina could do what other humans could not in absorbing beast blood and taking their strengths as her own. This meant she could essentially create any lineage factor she wanted so long as she had the blood to do it. And second, her existence was a lethal attraction to invalids, and especially variant invalids. In her rage, Aina's blood had begun to boil and her abyssal panther blood resurfaced, giving her a carnivorous edge. The first second felt like an eternity, but the second whizzed by so fast that it felt like they had been thrust into a pot of boiling oil. Their feet lit and their hearts threatened to jump out of their throats. Without a word, they dashed away, feeling the oppression about to suffocate them from all sides. The three clenched their fists as they picked a tunnel to rush into, unsurprisingly in the direction of Lionel's finger. If I wasn't so injured. Roxanne's nails dug into her palms, soothing herself with these thoughts of revenge and excuses. Ultimately, they were geniuses in their own right. How could they feel good about any of this? Now they could only hope that Lionel truly hadn't lied. You didn't run into any invalids while you were away? Lionel suddenly asked. Aina's back was still faced toward him and he couldn't seem to take his eyes off of her slowly receding tattoos. Aina turned back and smiled like a blossoming flower. It was just a simple question, but its meaning meant the world to her. Lionel was actually asking about her well-being. She didn't think she would miss something so simple, so profoundly. A small bit. I entered a subdimensional zone of the Silver Empire a few months ago and ran into some trouble there. But I came out fine. Lionel's brows shot up when he heard the word Silver Empire. It was an interesting coincidence. After a moment, Lionel nodded. Aina's words seemed to remind him of something else. As much as he wanted to control everything, there had been certain points where his people had been just fine on their own. His brothers had survived years in the dimensional verse without him. Aina had been through countless life and death experiences when he was nowhere to be found. Even the likes of Savon had been all on her own for a very long time. It was easy for him to only see things he had been through and filter everything through that lens, but there were people around him that had arguably been through worse. Every time he tried to shoehorn them into needing his protection, he was actually belittling them. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Have you thought about finding more powerful blood to ingest? I'm holding back on doing that for now. I'm very close to grasping a new, evolved force. Once I do, it'll burn away what remains of my curse and breakthrough. Oh. You're still holding back, huh? Lionel chuckled. Aina grinned. It's okay, you're still handsome when your face is swollen. I don't mind protecting you for a few more decades. Decades? Lionel scoffed. Like I said, I can beat you right now. Maybe you can, but would you? Aina blinked innocently, stretching her arms down toward her back and clasping her palms to rest on her ass. She leaned forward slightly and almost instantly, her chest seemed to double in size, her eyes glittering as she observed Lionel. Lionel opened his mouth to respond but suddenly found that his throat had dried out. Damned hormones, they had failed him again. Lionel shook his head and looked away. Come on little black star, let's go kill some Rapax. She really thinks she can bully us into submission. Aina's smile brightened as Lionel turned and walked away. She hadn't been this happy in a very long time. She sent a glance toward where the three youths had disappeared before entering a different entrance with Lionel. Not long after they had left. Bang! A rapax fell heavily from above, its silver body rippling with power and strength. Its head turned from side to side, eyeing 3 entrances before it made a choice and dove into one. Chapter 1357. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 1357. Easy to trust if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1357. Easy to trust. Aina thought about going to kill those 3. It would make her feel more at ease. Plus, there was also the chance that she would be able to take the final step toward earning an amethyst token if she did. But, she decided against it. For one, she didn't want to waste her and Lionel's time. Plus, though she knew Lionel likely wouldn't stop her, he wouldn't be ecstatic about it either. He was always soft when it came to that kind of thing, and Aina wasn't fooled by his newfound bravado. Under the surface, he was still very much the same Lionel. If anything, he was only being more open with his true self around her. The core parts of his character had always remained unchanged. There's no need to be so eager. Karma has its way of working things out. Aina shook her head. You? Believing in karma? You could come up with a better lie, you know. You just don't want me to kill them. Lionel smiled, lightly stroking little Blackstar's head. The little one was doing a bit better now, but Lionel could still feel him wince from time to time. He was too sensitive to little Blackstar's usual state to miss when he had shifted so far from baseline. Others might have a hard time reading a beast's emotions, but that wasn't the case for Lionel, especially when it came to a beast he was so intimately familiar with. A small distraction was exactly the kind of thing Lionel needed right now. Usually, such a thing would be almost impossible to find in a place like this, but he happened to have Aina by his side. As much as she had missed his care, Lionel had almost forgotten how much he liked to just talk with her. Lionel didn't get to do much talking these days. His most recent intimate conversations were with a 1,000-year-old ghost, and the other was in a drunken state he would rather forget. If Raj ever let him, that is. In a lot of ways, during their time together, Aina had become his best friend. This was maybe the greatest aspect of their relationship he had been ignoring the fact he missed. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Though they had been cordial over the last few days, and even somewhat close, there had always been a barrier there that neither had crossed, Aina out of respect and Lionel out of stubbornness. But this was why the words of his father were so profound to Lionel. He remembered that day he was in the Mayan tomb, a naked girl kneeling over him and threatening to choke what remained of his life out of his body. Back then, he had realized it was his 18th birthday and he sighed in relief. He had sighed in relief because if he died after his 18th birthday, it would no longer be his father's burden. His dad wouldn't have to feel guilt. He would have done his duty in getting Lionel to adulthood. It had been so long since then, but the sentiments still hung over Lionel's head. But his father's words seemed to snap him away. There wasn't some demarcating line where a father stopped being a father and a son stopped being a son. Lionel's logical brain had tried to make it like that, but it simply wasn't how life worked. To his dad, he was probably the very same baby boy he had been more than 2 decades ago. His father's words had sounded sharp and grating, but to Lionel, they were like a pass. His father reminding him that it was all right for him to take his time to grow, that he didn't have to be perfect immediately, that he still had his old man protecting him to his front. When it came to his father, it was very easy for Lionel to trust. Maybe not karma in the normal sense, but the old ghost has told me a lot of interesting things about force and how it breathes life into everything around it. It made me think, if force is the underlying foundation to all that there is, and every action causes a disruption in it, then there might very well be some supernatural balance that keeps everything in check. Who knows, maybe karma is real, then. Aina blinked. Old ghost? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel laughed. He had forgotten that there were now things in his life Aina was completely ignorant to. He was so used to telling her everything and her knowing everything he meant that he hadn't considered an opposing worldview. When Aina was caught up with Wise Star Order and everything related to him, her brows shot up. Unsurprisingly, she didn't like the idea of Lionel being in a constant death match with an old man so much more seasoned and experienced than him. But, it seemed that there would be no convincing Lionel otherwise, so she could only take a step back in this regard. Aina fell into her thoughts, her mind suddenly feeling as though it was blooming towards something new. The words Lionel had used to explain how Wise Star Order viewed the dimensional verse weren't things that she had ever heard before. No. It was more accurate to say that she had known of them, but she had never heard them stated so clearly and firmly. It made her wonder. Was this how her intuition worked? Did the Force speak to her like it had a life of their own? Is that what was always whispering to her whenever she made a decision about her training? Whenever she chose ingredients for a meal or a pill concoction? Aina's breathing grew deep and unhurried, her gaze glazing over for several moments. Seeing this, Lionel smiled but didn't say anything. It seemed that she was having another breakthrough. Right then, Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. He gently placed little Black Star on Aina's shoulder before his figure vanished. In the very next instant, he had appeared dozens of meters away, soaring through the air above the head of a ruined Rapax. His eyes glowed with a hidden crimson light, a murderous intent erupting from him. Chapter 1358. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 27 seconds p.m. Chapter 1358. Couldn't if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1358 couldn't bang. Lionel's fist flew forward like a falling meteor, shattering the metallic carapace of ruined Rapax before him. From start to finish, it had been an absolute slaughter. What had started off as a Rapax stalking their position had immediately turned into an all-out assault. In one moment, Lionel had been by Aina's side, in the next he was above a Rapax's head, his fist falling as though an ice-infused rock through the atmosphere. His gaze flashed with a hidden rune, his body covered in a destructive crimson coating that seemed to burn everything in its path. In a single strike, a Tier 9 5th dimension ruined Rapax had fallen without even a method to fight back. As cautious as Lionel had been last time, he didn't even bother to store this Rapax away before it died. His foot stamped down on its neck, shattering its spine and severing his head from its shoulders. Then, he ripped out what remained of its spine, taking with it its tail. He snapped it all together, squeezing tight until the joints crumbled together into a long makeshift polearm with a scorpion-like blade on one end. It alone was easily over 3 meters long, but Lionel didn't seem to care at all. Ignoring the dismembered corpse, he took his new spear and turned back to find Aina waiting with little Black Star in her arms. "Don't look at me like that, there was really nothing I could say this time," Lionel said. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. It was true, the Rapax had just fallen from the skies and it tried to stalk them, maybe because it had more questions than answers about certain things. It wasn't exactly the situation for Lionel to explain things before he acted. "No, you definitely could have, but that's not what I'm looking at you for. You got stronger again." "Oh, that. I was teetering on a breakthrough before I fought the 6th-dimensional ruined Rapax and I broke through just before I beat it. It's pretty useful." Aina's irises twinkled. Her senses weren't as sharp as Lionel's, but her battle sense and intuition was on a different level entirely. She could tell that Lionel's force output, as in the strength in his arms and legs, hadn't changed at all. And yet, somehow, his damage potential had skyrocketed enough to make a ruined Rapax look like Play-Doh. The difference was enormous. Of course, the only ruined Rapax Lionel had fought until now was a 6th-dimensional one, so he didn't have an appropriate gauge for how powerful they were in the 5th dimension. But, they still knew enough to know that they should be more powerful than that. This breakthrough Lionel was speaking of was the formation of his Scarlet Star rune. He had been on the verge of forming it before and just barely managed to against the 6th-dimensional ruined Rapax. Unfortunately, against it hadn't been enough. But, against its lower dimensional counterpart, it was a different matter entirely. In its presence, things tended to become far more fragile than they really were, and even without any additional force output, it was as though the world scaled down in its sturdiness to benefit Lionel. Plus, it felt more pointed and controlled. Lionel was a bit confident now that he could use a spear without destroying it, but he still chose this route instead so that he could fine-tune some things. This spear would do him well enough for now. Plus, he felt that he was close to tier 6 after forming his rune, and he didn't want to have to lose another spear under the whims of a sudden breakthrough as his 8th star formed. Aina, though, didn't take her off of Lionel. I know I looked very valiant just now, but I have a head between these broad shoulders. Lionel feigned hurt. You can't just look at me like a slab of meat. Aina was caught off guard for a moment before she sputtered. She knew this was Lionel's way of getting her back for just moments before. Maybe only these two could so casually banter this deep into enemy territory as though there wasn't a hunter coming at them right this moment. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net, that's not it. It's just that your dad seemed to have done something to you. You don't feel any different? Nothing's changed? Lionel paused for a moment, not answering immediately. The two broke out into a run once again, heading down the winding tunnels. Lionel's sense of direction was immaculate, and despite the number of twists and turns they took, he was always able to point out the very same direction he had pointed out to the 3 youths that had followed them. He only had 2 goals in mind. The first was to avoid the center of these nests. There was no doubt that they were the most protected regions, and they would also have the most powerful warriors. The center was where the eggs should converge and be located, so it made sense they would be the most heavily guarded. With this goal in mind, he had to ensure that the paths he took brought him closer to the direction he wanted to go while not locking them into an obvious death sentence. The second goal, obviously, was to continue to head in the direction of the nearest exit. I'm not sure. It both feels like I've changed and that I haven't. My mind is clearer and more relaxed, my number of split minds increased another tenfold from 10 million, and I've suddenly thought of countless other ways to use my ability index. But, I also don't feel different. It just feels natural. Lionel knew that there was something off. His ability had gone from being suppressed back down to tier 3 to suddenly being stronger within tier 4 than he had ever been in a benign environment. He had no doubt that if he returned to a lesser world now, he would experience another huge burst to his ability that was still being hampered here. It was just that, he couldn't understand why. Fallen Apostle's reception has been amazing. Thank you all for the support. Chapter 1359. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 25 seconds p.m. Chapter 1359. Square 1. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1359. Square 1. Lionel had been aware that his father had been tinkering with his body for a long while. Maybe it took a personality like Lionel's to not be bothered by it in the slightest. The first oddity was obviously the vomit smoothies he had been forced to drink for as long as he could remember. His father had been so insistent that despite hating it with all his being, Lionel still never missed a single day. In the end, it seemed to have been worth it. Originally, Lionel had thought that it was designed to strengthen his body. Right after the metamorphosis, his body seemed to undergo odd burst periods where his speed and strength would increase faster than they should for a person without using a special training technique or method. But, after reawakening his innate node, Lionel became almost 100% certain that the smoothies were actually for the purpose of providing enough strength to allow him to accomplish such a feat, something he hadn't quite understood was an enormous deal until meeting Y's star order. However, now, Lionel was suddenly not so sure anymore. For one, the entire reason he had had such an enormous store of anarchic force within his body to begin with was because, according to Y's star order, he had stolen energy from the regulator. If the energy he needed to reform his innate node came from the regulator, then what role did the smoothies play? Was he overthinking things? Had he been mistaken? Or was it that both had played a role? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Lionel suddenly felt that he understood far too little about his dad. The man was messing with his son's body as though he had access to the knobs that defined everything that was him. That old man probably knows how to create lineage factors, I don't doubt it at all. Lionel thought to himself. Lionel shook his head, his mind somehow both absent and running a million miles an hour at the same time. His father seemed to be dealing with a burden he wasn't telling anyone about. Lionel wanted to help, but there was really only so much he could do, not while he was still so weak. This was another large part of the reason he had made the decision to set aside the king nonsense for now to focus on blooming his own strength. As for how he would do that, he would just continue almost the path he was already on, focusing on comprehending his innate node. He hadn't forgotten that that ticking time bomb was still looming over his head. At the same time, he also had to gain a firmer comprehension of his ability index as well, though that no longer seemed to be as important now that he could access Tier 4 on the Void battlefield. Wise Star Order had said that Lionel's Dream Force affinity was far too high for the level of mastery he had over his ability index, but he still had no real idea how to use it. This situation seemed to answer the question of how quite well. His father had sealed a portion of his ability, or at least what seemed like his ability. As for what extent, by Lionel's estimation, it should probably be a level infinitesimally close to the savant realm. If he was truly a savant, he shouldn't be able to utilize force or comprehend the universal cycles, so this was the best explanation he could come up with. Of course, Lionel had thought of the wild possibility that his father had actually suppressed his ability from the savant levels down to normal ranges precisely so that he could do what savants normally could not. But, after some more thought, Lionel felt that this was likely not the case. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. While it wasn't the first time his father had accomplished something impossible, this felt like far more of a special case. During the months Lionel was bedridden and couldn't move, he had had a great number of talks with Wise Star Order, and in that time, he had come to understand savants a bit more. The main reason Lionel thought it was impossible was because suppressing the ability of savants wasn't a rare ability. No, it was rare. It was instead more accurate to say that all those of a certain level of power could do so. This power referred not to individual power, but rather the power of a family or organization. The suppression and control of savants was an entire sort of industry in and of itself, and it wasn't as difficult as it might seem, or else savants would rule everything. In fact, the favored method of organizations and families that had savants was precisely to suppress them from Tier 5 down to a lesser Tier 4 or Tier 3. In extreme cases, it was even possible to suppress a savant down to the point they had no ability to access whatsoever, exactly like Earth had done with its savants. The methods ranged from as simple as Earth's, which only required isolating the savants from force, to far more sophisticated methods wherein savants might even end up permanently crippled without special intervention. This was all to say that even in such situations where savants were suppressed to lesser tiers, they were still unable to do as Lionel could do and begin to increase their strength as a normal person would. The moment you were born a savant, you were forever cut off from such things. And that didn't even consider the biggest elephant in the room. If Lionel was born a savant, he would have never been gifted an innate node by the regulator to begin with. Savants couldn't have or form nodes, so they likewise couldn't have innate nodes. In addition, if a savant were to be given control over Scarlet Star Force, they would be similar to Elthar and his chaotic particle affinity. They wouldn't be given an innate node to begin with. This evidence left Lionel at a bit of a loss for how to comprehend his father's actions. It truly felt too disjointed and none of it made sense. So, he was right back to square one. Not understanding a thing. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1360. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 24 seconds p.m. Chapter 1360. Profound analysis. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1360. Profound analysis. It wasn't all bad, though. This gave Lionel a chance to breathe a sigh of relief. Without having to worry about the weakness of his ability index for a while, he could focus on his Scarlet Star innate node like he had wanted to. The formation of a single rune seemed to remind Lionel of just how far away he was from comprehending it entirely. This singular rune was just a small branch of a small corner of a small segment of a small piece of the overall natural force art that called his innate node home. Having comprehending a single one, his force seemed to flow smoother and his destructive capability had skyrocketed. But, other than this, it was just a reminder that he was weak. If I had to improve, what would you say I have to do? Lionel suddenly asked Aina. The two had been running for quite a while, but the tunnels were far too expansive. They hadn't even run into another Rapax in over an hour. Lionel's sense of direction had remained true and they were getting closer to their destination. Right now, Lionel could imagine them curling around the center of this particular nest, avoiding its core regions while slingshotting closer to the exit. This method would take longer, but it was also safer. And, with the boost to his internal sight, Lionel could ensure that it stayed that way. As much as he wanted revenge for Little Blackstar, there were only so many Shadow Sovereigns the Rapax could have. Not to mention the fact they were a rare breed to begin with, the Rapax rarely awakened such abilities as well. To Lionel, this meant that he would be able to find this individual again in due time so long as they didn't die. You're asking me? Aina raised an eyebrow. I don't know if I'm the best to ask. The path I take is different from yours. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Aina and Lionel never really interfered in each other's training, they just left each other to their own devices. So, Aina was a bit caught off guard by this question as well. I want to know your opinion. When our minds connected, you felt it too, right? Aina blushed slightly. That experience was a bit. Well, she had definitely been impulsive. But, whether it was true or not, she still felt that allowing Lionel into her mind like that had made it far easier for him to make the decision he had just moments ago. She wasn't wrong in thinking this either. Though Lionel had tried to ignore it, Aina's emotions had hit him like a ton of bricks. But, as he had said, he was very good at closing himself off from such emotions. Aina had mostly been able to ignore that moment because she fell into a deep sleep right afterward. But, now that Lionel had brought it up, all those memories kept rushing back. It was just a shame that Lionel's mind was far too complex for her to truly understand in that short span of time. Unlike Wise Star Order, she couldn't shift through millions of minds in the blink of an eye. I did, but it was too vague. It was hard to get a read on you because you have too many split minds. And, at the same time, my ability weakened a lot when applied to another person. That's fine, just tell me your perspective. Well, I don't really need to tell you what my ability thought, I can just tell you what I think from observing you. When you said you could beat someone as powerful as me 10 out of 10 times, I don't think you were lying, but I think that's actually part of the problem. Well, it isn't objectively a problem, but it's rather a problem relatively speaking considering the path you seem to be taking. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Lionel was intrigued. He was interested in what Aina wanted to say. Right now, you are focusing on your innate node, and rightfully so. Most probably should do that, especially if you're on a ticking time clock like your ancestor said. But, given your battle style, it might make more sense to focus more on your ability instead. Your raw battle strength isn't your greatest strength, your mind is. Battle sense is something that's difficult to quantify and it's especially so for you. Within a certain reasonable range, even without time to prepare, I would think that there are a rare few people you can't defeat. If you had time to prepare, I think that even outside a reasonable range, you could still find a path to victory. But that's exactly the problem. Honing your strength requires repeatedly nailing down your strengths, then doubling and tripling down. It's all about reproducing results and making sure that your battles are almost formulaic in their outcome. In my opinion, the strongest warriors are those that can force any enemy to fight on their chosen battlefield. Then, upon making said enemy meet you on your terms, you can reproduce the same victory again and again. You, though, are the exact opposite. Because your mind is your greatest asset, the more variables there are, the more randomness and variety, the higher your chances. But, because of that, you can't reproduce your results. Every victory looks different, and you don't mind meeting an enemy on their battlefield. This can look like a good thing, but what it also means is that a large majority of the training you do ends up being wasted. For every 100% increase to your overall strength, the strongest person you can defeat increases by a marginal amount until you trigger a watershed. Sometimes the return is even worse. One day you might double your speed, but you're just as content to not move a single step in a battle so long as you think this is the best approach to victory. At the same time, you might break through in your bowmanship, but you won't even bother to use it if you can think of a better method. Because you approach battle like this, focusing on anything other than your mind seems like a waste of effort. Or, at the very least, it should be your main focus. Lionel fell into silence. He knew that Aina would have something profound to say. But, this was still beyond his expectations. What should he do? The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1361. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1361. Archetypes. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1361 Archetypes. Aina couldn't have been more right. In fact, she was so right that Lionel almost regretted not having asked this question earlier. All of his tendencies, she had gotten down to an exact science. Lionel rarely, if ever, went all out in battle. Sometimes it wasn't even as Aina said and that he just felt there was a more efficient way to win. Sometimes it was just because he liked having trump cards in his back pocket to prepare a perfect counter-attack given the situation. The style of battle Lionel liked to use was one that withheld as many cards as possible until it was the most advantageous moment to use them. There was even a very long time in his life where he didn't even use his speed branch of his snowy star owl lineage factor because it was so much more beneficial to have his enemies believe him to be a slow, bumbling spearman. And this was just one example. Lionel could think of countless others Aina hadn't mentioned, like his wisdom branch, his gravity domain. Sometimes he even neglected to use his radiant force despite the fact fire elemental force was quite literally one of his most powerful weapons. Then there was the most glaring one, his bow force. It was fine if Lionel saved his bow force as a trump card back when he could only use it 2 or 3 times in battle before collapsing. But now that he had a quasi-life grade bow, he quite literally didn't have this problem at all. It had been entirely negated. Yet, Lionel was content to keep this card in back pocket, waiting for the moment he had to use it. But, all of this was fine until Lionel considered the words Aina hadn't spoken. A true warrior brought out their greatest strength and forced their enemies to meet them on their terms. They didn't care about the retaliation of their enemy because they were already confident that their greatest strength would trump everything. Compared to this ideal, Lionel was sorely lacking. In fact, his battle style could even be said to be directly opposing to Valiant. In some way, he had been aware of this. That was why during his battle with Miguel, he had chosen not to use his ability index at all. Lionel was far too confident in his ability to win with his mind. Even the likes of Miguel would only be a matter of an added bit of effort. If Lionel was honest, though, let alone a valiant warrior, his method of battle definitely didn't feel like the way of a king either, and that was just the honest truth. Lionel fell into his thoughts, not quite sure of what direction to go in. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. He didn't want to become a brute who only thought of honor in battle. That wasn't him, even though he liked to dabble in it from time to time. He would never act that way during a battle that really meant something. At best, he had seen Miguel as a bit of fun, but he felt that Aina's words had great merit as well. What use was his training if he threw it all out the window the instant he entered a battle? It was no wonder why he could never settle on a style. He was constantly going his own way and making up his own path. Style. Lionel's gaze suddenly flashed. Create new ability subcategory. Call it Dream Class. Set parameters. Archer. Spearman. Fighter. Mage. Set subparameters. Sniper Archer. Explosive Archer. Strong Spearman. Flexible Spearman. Mixed Fighter. Speed Fighter. Fire Mage. Defensive Mage. Combat Mage. Lionel's mind went into overdrive, formulating a new ability, splitting it into 4 sub-categories and then further into 9 sub-categories. Dream Class was an application of Lionel's Tier 4 control. Lionel saw this situation just like he had his spear dilemma. He could never decide whether to focus on instinct or calculation, until the day it all snapped into place and he felt he could subtly grasp the intricacies of both. This would be no different. Lionel had 4 main archetypes: archer, spearman, fighter, and mage. Depending on the situation, he tended to rely on one or the other, sometimes mixing and matching. This time, however, he would do so far more deliberately. By shifting these 4 archetypes into a Tier 4 ability, he was essentially honing all the skill his body had in a certain path and fine-tuning it to maximize his strength in this category. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. For example, if Lionel ran into an opponent he thought would best be dealt with as an archer, the first thing he would ask himself is if he should be a sniper archer or explosive archer. The sniper archer archetype focused on long-ranged, unmoving assault. It was a relentless pinning of an enemy from a distance. Explosive archer involved movement. The power output was less than that of the sniper archer, but its flexibility benefited from it. Once Lionel made the decision of which to go with, he would activate Dream Class. Once Dream Class was in effect, everything about Lionel's very being would shift to optimize this archetype. If he chose explosive archer, he would hone in on light elemental force. Movement technique conducive to evasion and firing at the same time would be prioritized, and he would focus on rapid fire rather than powerful shots. If he chose sniper archer, his element of choice would lean more toward fire. He would root himself in place, focusing on heaviness and power. Every strike would be aimed toward maximizing strength and quality of shot. Organize all techniques and abilities, categorize into archetypes, deduce strength. Lionel began to organize everything he knew one by one. Some abilities fit into multiple archetypes, but he didn't mind duplicating them as he saw fit. Soon, he had finished tabulating the result and had come to a conclusion. Sniper archer, 0. 58 explosive archer, 0. 31 strong spearman, 0. 13 flexible spearman, 0. 11 mixed fighter, 0. 07 speed fighter, 0. 07 fire mage, 0. 18 defensive mage, 0. 11 combat mage, 0. 10. Lionel realized that of all the archetypes he could fit into, only sniper archer was even close to meeting his maximum output while relying on his ability index. All of the rest were severely lacking. Chapter 1362. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 1362, Efficiency. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1362 Efficiency. Though Lionel had subconsciously always known, seeing the numbers laid out before him now was depressing. It only put into perspective just how right Ana was. The numbers were fairly straightforward. 100 was a theoretical maximum that Lionel could reach. This maximum was decided by the maximum strength Lionel could match by using his mind. This theoretical limit thus became his ceiling. It was difficult for Lionel to put a real tier or dimension on this max strength of his because the numbers were all so variable. No 2 tier 9s were the same, and depending on talent, ability index, lineage factors, and a host of other variables, the strength of 2 individuals could be wildly different. This was why Lionel could use tricks in his mind to defeat 6-dimensional existences of lesser galaxies, while here, it hadn't been rare for him to run into 5th-dimensional existence he had to put in quite some effort to defeat. Even now, Lionel didn't believe that he had met the theoretically strongest existence within the 5th dimension yet. That Tier 9 runed Raypax he had just defeated was only of a particular grade, and according to Y's star order, there were definitely far more powerful runed Raypax. This was all to say that assigning a value of 100 to his adjusted strength output was the best that Lionel could do. This was the value that took in a combination of everything he could do, his mind, his thinking speed, his quick reaction times and deduction abilities, and put them together to formulate a certain ceiling of strength. When things were looked at this way, the numbers became far more depressing. Sniper Archer was the best, but even that could only bring out 58% of Lionel's true strength. A step down from that was Explosive Archer, but it plummeted 27 points down to 31%. The rest were even worse. Lionel almost couldn't help but chuckle. It's not accurate to say that this is 58% of my true strength, but it's more like a measurement of efficiency. The closer I am to 100%, the more exponential the increase in my output, with a massive watershed occurring probably at least once per 20 points. That means I'm a lot further away than just 42% away. And that's just with one. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Sniper Archer being the strongest wasn't a surprise to Lionel. Bar none, Lionel's strongest strength currently was his bow force. So long as he could be rooted to a singular spot and shoot to his heart's content, his power output would be devastating. However, the rest was far worse. Fire Mage was a bit of a surprise at 0.18, but this was likely due to Lionel comprehending the first rune of his Scarlet Star Force. Just that comprehension alone had closed the gap between his bow force and his lesser dimensional fire force by a great measure. What if? Calculate. Scarlet Mage. Scarlet Mage, 3.19. Seeing this number, Lionel sighed. It seems that even his mind couldn't make up the gap of his inability to use Scarlet Star Force freely. 319% was a value that he found difficult to compute, especially since the scale he was using was exponential. If he ignored everything and was content to end his life here and now, it might not be impossible for him to kill even a quasi-seventh dimensional existence. After finishing these calculations, Lionel explained them all to Aina. After she looked at him a bit weirdly for a moment, she opened her mouth to speak, only to be stopped by Lionel's chuckle. What is it? Do you always break down your abilities with such raw numbers? I used to do it a lot more frequently, but the system was flawed when I used it on others because there were too many variables to account for. It's 100% accurate when I use it on myself, though. It's just that there's no real point in doing so. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Well, honestly, I'm not sure how these numbers would translate in the future. If you increase the efficiency of each individual class, what would happen to your overall strength? How would you calculate it if the goalposts kept moving? Instead of moving the goalposts, I could just put a stake down as a checkpoint. That way, there will be a version 1 of 1.00 and a version 2. Sure, you could do that, but then what would be the point? If your individual classes would also be behind whatever version 2, 3, or 4 there was, then it just goes back to the idea that you should be focused on your mind anyway. Maybe. Unless I have a different sort of end goal. Aina's brow raised, waiting for Lionel to continue. Technically, given a number of factors, I could probably make a lot more than just 9 classes. If I mix and match, I could make classes like Spearman Mage or Fire Archer, or any other number of things. The reason why I chose these exact 9, though, was because they are the most foundational. Everything else grows outward from them. However, it's because it's all so disjointed that I'm probably having such issues to begin with, right? But, if I can increase the efficiency of each one, then my ability to tell exactly what should be used in battle skyrockets as well. I tend to use as little as possible in battle, in one part to keep trump cards, but another reason is because it's easier to perform high-level calculations when the variables are minimized. Oddly enough, the reason why Sniper Archer is probably highest isn't only due to my bow force, but it's also by far the simplest of all the classes. If I can raise the efficiency of each class to 60, 70, maybe even 90%, or a theoretical 100% in the future, then how well I can shift from one style in battle to another also increases. Then, the day that I can use them all seamlessly and form a unique style of my own will be in reach. Lionel smiled. This was what he wanted. A fusion of instinctual combat given by individual classes and his mind's calculative abilities. The results would definitely be beyond imagination. We're out of this hive. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1363. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 22 p.m. Chapter 1363, Escape or Gamble? If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. 1363 Escape or gamble? Lionel came to a pause, his gaze sharpening. His makeshift spear was gripped in his hands and his senses were primed. Their journey through this hive had been too smooth. Remembering back to the map Little Blackstar had gotten them, there was only one more hive to go through before they could escape this part of the void battlefield. But it was all too convenient. Little Blackstar had managed to move fast enough to avoid the initial lock of senses that could have gone poorly for them. However, he had still ended up being detected by the Shadow Sovereign Rapax. Knowing this, the fact that they had only been hounded by a single Tier 9 runed Rapax was too odd. Then there was something else to consider. From Little Blackstar's memory, the shadow domain of the Shadow Sovereign Rapax had been far smaller than it should have been while deployed. In fact, it was only 2 or 3 meters in diameter, a size when compared to the scope of this network of nests was like a needle drifting through the ocean. If it wasn't because Little Blackstar was trying to blanket everything, it would have never been a problem. One might not understand why this was so odd. Given the fact that maintaining a shadow domain was so taxing on the user, wouldn't it make sense to keep it as small as possible to begin with? Since the shadow domain followed its deployer as its epicenter, it was much more convenient to maintain a small shadow domain, especially for a hand-to-hand combat race like the Rapax. So long as they were fighting an enemy, 3 meters was more than enough to keep their target within frame. Lionel had, of course, thought of this as well. But he still felt that something was off. For one, a shadow domain wasn't under constant deployment. It required active thought and action to use. That meant, if one was focused on maintaining your stamina, you wouldn't deploy it at all. Secondly, if under normal conditions you wouldn't deploy a shadow domain, that would mean that there were very few instances where you would. One such instance was for the purpose of what Little Blackstar had tried to do by helping Lionel and Aina. However, another one should be battle. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The issue was neither of these reasons made sense. Why would a Rapax be fighting in their own nest? Of course, this was an odd thing to say considering they had been invaded by the likes of Lionel and the others, but the problem here was that a Rapax of such status wouldn't personally help deal with what amounted to small fry in their eyes. Something about this just feels off. This sort of trial is too dangerous to begin with. Thrusting us all into enemy territory like this without an easy way to come back just makes no sense. This feels like a stealth mission, but Void Palace isn't a place that grooms assassins. There might be 1 or 2 factions within that cater to that demographic, but definitely not enough to throw an entire generation under the bus like this. I would understand if we were just thrown onto the battlefield itself and it was just a matter of survival. But a Rapax nest? That's more than a little excessive. Plus, from Mom's story about her relationship with Dad, she wasn't even allowed to step onto the void battlefield until she became a galaxy-ranked disciple. And even then, she had Dad as a supervisor to protect her. Did things really change this much? Is there new management? Is it possible that I'm being targeted? Or is it because this generation is more talented than others? But if it's because we're more talented, even if you up the difficulty by a margin, was it necessary to react to this good news by throwing us into a fiery pit of hell? Lionel didn't even know what to think. Still, everything seemed to point toward this matter being a special event of sorts. If he was correct, then the odd coincidence of the Rapax he had met until this point being so manageable might not be such a coincidence at all. Lionel explained his thoughts to Aina. So you think that the Rapax are occupied by something, which would explain the oddity of the shadow domain that hurt Blackstar? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. I think so. It would both explain why this Shadow Sovereign hasn't come after us yet and why we've only run into manageable enemies. In fact, the only 6-dimensional Rapax we ran into was due to the fact I forced us to teleport together. If we had teleported individually like was intended, I have a feeling that we wouldn't have had to deal with even that. If it really is a special event like you said, then there's 2 possibilities. The first is that we're supposed to take advantage of this lull and security to escape as fast as possible. Or or were supposed to go to the center of the nest to begin with, Lionel finished. In truth, Lionel should have thought of this long ago. However, his life experiences had skewed his bias too far. Someone who innately trusted organizations might have already thought that there was no way the Void Palace would send their students to their death. As such, they would conclude that this couldn't possibly be an impossible task and that there was either a hidden challenge here or the Void Palace had made it easier to escape. Lionel, however, who always seemed to have terrible luck with organizations, only really trusted himself. As such, he had little to no expectations of others helping him to remain safe at all. As such, in an irony of all ironies, Lionel, who had one of the sharpest minds of this generation, was actually one of the last to figure out something so simple. "What do you want to do?" Lionel asked. "Escape or gamble?" Aina smiled. "Let's have fun." As expected, Lionel was correct. The greatest geniuses of this generation, a group that would have been amethyst in almost any over-selection year, had already begun to converge upon the central nest. Chapter 1364. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 1364. Stumbled. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. After stabilizing Little Blackstar and placing him within the segmented cube, Aina and Lionel broke out into a dead sprint. No longer worried about being found out and being more confident in the sort of trial they were currently taking part in, they took smaller measures toward protecting themselves in such a fashion. However, even as they ran, Lionel didn't forget to check all his bases. This sort of thing. It was still leaving an odd taste in his mouth. This matter seemed to require precise timing, but it had to be remembered that Lionel's actions had stalled the true selection for several months. Of course, it was possible that this event could take place over a long period of time, which was why the elders of the Void Palace would feel confident in allowing this to happen in the first place, but there was no way for Lionel to tell immediately. Luckily, he had a trusty encyclopedia of sorts. "Old man, what do you think about this?" Lionel reached out to Wise Star Order. But, surprisingly, he didn't get an answer. He tried again, but was once more met with more silence. After a while, Lionel chuckled. "You don't need to be scared, old man, my dad isn't here anymore. You can stop hiding." Not that it would do you much good to begin with. A light cough resounded in Lionel's ears. It seemed filled with a hint of embarrassment and another part righteous indignation, as though he was offended by the accusation. Unfortunately, there was no hiding it. When Velasco had appeared, Wise Star Order thought his life was forfeit. Though Lionel had vouched for this odd relationship of theirs, when a father wanted to act, what could a son do? This was especially so with Velasco, considering anything Wise Star Order did in front of that man felt all too easy for the former to see right through. Luckily, he had left without doing much more than glancing in his general direction. However, Wise Star Order was still suffering from cold sweats. "Just tell me, is there any ritual the Rapax might undergo, maybe something that is predictable, that would also last for a very long time? It should also be something that others might be able to benefit from, because I don't see why the Void Palace would allow this unless there were benefits to be gotten. Oh, and these benefits probably shouldn't be enough to move seventh-dimensional existences. Or, at the very least, they should be useless to seventh-dimensional existences, or else it wouldn't make sense for them to leave this opportunity to us rather than taking advantage themselves." This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Lionel gave Wise Star Order a list of requirements, hoping the old man would be able to think of something. He would assume that a race like the Rapax might have many rituals and customs that could fall into such a category, but hopefully only a few that might be related to a nest while also fitting these requirements. However, the answer he received from Wise Star Order was outside of his expectations. No. There shouldn't be any ritual of the like. The Rapax aren't a race that participates in such things. They have a very strict hierarchy, they live for war, and duty is at the forefront of their minds. They're very big on cycles of life and giving, not to mention oneness of mind and purpose. It wouldn't be like them to divert their attention toward any sort of ceremony. Lionel's brow furrowed. If there was no ritual, then what could possibly be happening? Then what about something that would require a large amount of precise control? There's a shadow sovereign Rapax here whose shadow domain was shrunk to a suspiciously small area. The only reason I can think of that such a thing would be necessary is if they needed extremely fine control over a given area, but that much is far too broad. A shadow domain allowed a shadow sovereign to bend reality to their whims within certain limits, of course depending on dimensional level. The larger the domain, the more stamina it took. So, Lionel assumed that if the shadow domain had been shrunk, and it was unlike the shadow sovereign was in a heated battle, then it must be trying to control something or the environment around something. The Rapax birthed a shadow sovereign? The shout reverberated through Lionel's mind, almost causing his feet to stumble. Aina quickly reached out a hand, stabilizing his shoulder with a worried expression on her face. Her first instinct was to think that what had happened before still had lingering effects on Lionel. What the hell, old man? In his shock, Wise Star Order had done the equivalent of violently shaking Lionel's soul. That felt no different from poking and prodding at an open wound. This wasn't because Lionel's soul was injured, but rather because it was like tender flesh in its current state. It was incredibly sensitive to outside pressures. Shut up, brat, you have no idea what this means. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net obviously not. That's why I'm asking you. I told you before that the Rapax don't really have any culture or rituals, this much is true. But, they do have certain legends that they abide by. The birth of a shadow sovereign is akin to the birth of a king for the Rapax. A ruined Rapax with the abilities of a shadow sovereign is like a real dragon. Upon reaching maturity, such an existence would be practically untouchable. Why do you keep saying birth? Because it hasn't been born yet, idiot. It's definitely still within its egg. How the hell do you know that? Common sense. You keep thinking that the domain is too small when in reality it never shrunk to begin with, that's just its original size. That's impossible. Little Black Star wouldn't lose to a newborn. It's not just a newborn, fool. Like I told you before, the Rapax have a tradition of using fertilizer for their newborn. But, when a talent on this level is in the process of being nurtured, they go several steps further. Even living Rapax pour all of their strength into it. This baby, under the Rapax care and nurturing, would be born at Tier 9 of the 5th dimension instantly. Wait. Lionel suddenly thought of a possibility. That's right. All the Rapax here, especially those of the highest levels, are currently severely weakened because they've given everything to this newborn. That's likely why the Void Palace saw fit to send you all in. But that isn't enough of a reason for you to have screamed in my ears like that. Of course it is. Rapax are the only humanoid species born from eggs. In that state, they're not only very vulnerable, but they're basically just like enormous beast crystals. Except unlike beast crystals, swallowing the essence of a Rapax egg that has been prepared in this fashion comes with its own supporting vitality. What I'm trying to say is that regardless of your ability index, if you swallow the essence of a Rapax egg that's had so much vitality and life force poured into it, you gain its ability without any side effects or impact to your own ability index. Lionel almost stumbled and fell again. This time, it had nothing to do with Wise Star Order yelling in his ear. Chapter 1365. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 1365. There was a reason if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again 1365. There was a reason Lionel was stunned, not knowing how to take this news. Even the silver tablet couldn't do this. When the silver tablet erased the personality of a previously held ability, it could be absorbed. But, one still had to be very careful about doing so. This was because when absorbed, both abilities would combine and an average of the two would be taken. This meant that if you absorbed an ability completely incompatible with yourself, you would essentially be crippling both abilities, and by proxy, yourself. However, according to Wise Star Order, absorbing the essence of this egg would be like gaining a second ability without the side effects. The weird thing about this though was, why was it that the elders of Void Palace didn't want this? Why would anyone be opposed to something that essentially broke the fundamental rules of the dimensional verse? Why? Lionel asked. Are they really so kind-hearted to leave this to us? Kind-hearted? Wise Star Order snorted. The Raypaks aren't fools. Do you think they would leave themselves in such a vulnerable position just because? This entire hive is blocked off from existences above the sixth dimension. In fact, it's not just this, but even higher level sixth-dimensional existences have been completely blocked off. You lot are about the only ones that can enter in the first place. Secondly, did you not hear what I said about vitality? It's the copious amounts of vitality within the Raypak's egg that tricks the regulator into believing there are two people, not one. This, as a result, allows the birth of two ability indexes within the same person. However, this vitality must be above or, at the very least, near your own. Like I said, the baby Raypaks will be born at Tier 9 of the 5th dimension using this ritual. That means you can't be much stronger than this, or else your vitality will be too great. If your vitality is too high, the regulator won't sense two lives, it will only sense yours. Once that happens, your two abilities will fuse instead of remaining separate. That means that it's impossible for anyone that's too high tiered to absorb this egg at all. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. When it all settled in, Lionel let out a breath. So things were like this. The elders of the Void Palace couldn't absorb this boon even if they wanted to. Aina, Lionel quickly explained everything Wise Star Order had explained to him. After taking it all in, she seemed to sigh a breath. So that's where that feeling was coming from. When they had first landed here, Aina had said that there was something incredibly nutritious nearby. She had assumed, along with Lionel, that this came from the eggs and the fertilizer used to upkeep them. And she was most definitely correct. It was just that she couldn't have imagined that things would actually be like this. This was more than just a little nutritious, it was absolutely game-changing. There were very few things in the dimensional verse that could break the balance of rule set. At the same time, though, this was odd. The Shadow Sovereign ability seemed perfect for Aina. But, if it was really so perfect, her ability index would have violently tugged her in that direction. Much like how she always knew the best meals to prepare for herself and the best training methods to use, she would also know when a great opportunity for improvement was nearby. If things had worked out as they should have, she would have figured out the use of this egg long before Lionel did and given him this information. Knowing this, Lionel would have drawn the appropriate conclusions long ago. This is perfect for you, Lionel said. Your battle style would fit seamlessly with this, I would think. It would also greatly boost your darkness affinity. No, I think it'll be best if you absorb it, Aina suddenly said. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel rose an eyebrow. It wasn't that Shadow Sovereign wouldn't be useful to him. Given his mind, technically speaking, any additional strength he gained made it less likely for anyone to defeat him. The more tools he had at his disposal, the more options he had to react in battle. However, Lionel wasn't too eager for this at the same time. And, there was no point for Little Blackstar to absorb the same ability index again. That left Aina as the best candidate. My body doesn't seem to want it, Aina said after a while. I'm not sure why, but the more I think about it, the stronger my revulsion toward it grows. This is the first time I've felt this way. Usually I feel either nothing or positive emotions. I've never felt a negative emotion before. I feel that it would cripple me. Lionel's gaze flashed. He couldn't quite understand why Aina would feel this way, he didn't have a proper understanding. But, regardless, he trusted her judgment for herself. It hadn't failed her before and he didn't see why it would start now. Plus, you spoke about your armor and your goals for it, right? A high darkness affinity is something you'll need if you want to find a way to counter your Scarlet Star Force with Void Star Force. Lionel fell into silence. Aina wasn't wrong, it was just that he had another solid method of raising his darkness elemental affinity to great heights. But, now that she mentioned it, this method just might be the easiest. Lionel didn't know much about these sovereigns, but he thought that it was about time he learned more. All right. He nodded. Rapax. Ana's thighs suddenly grew a size as she stamped a foot down hard. She blasted by Lionel, her battle axe shimmering. By the time Lionel rounded the corner, the Rapax in question had been split into two. However, it was what lay beyond that truly caught Lionel's attention. The good news? They had made it to the core of the network of nests like they wanted to. The bad news? Well, there was a reason they had run into so few Rapax during their time here. Chapter 1366. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1366. Muted if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1366 muted. Lionel took a breath, his grip on his spear tightening slightly. They were everywhere. Or, at the very least, it truly felt like it. The center of the nest was an enormous, perforated, ball of rock. Pathways of all shapes and sizes, winding in all sorts of different directions, jetted out from the perforations. This perforated ball of rock hovered above what looked like a green sea. This oddly discolored sea gave off a strong, pungent smell that seared one's nose hairs and tingled the skin. It looked like a vat of acid, and Lionel wasn't convinced that if he took a dip, that it would react any differently from one either. The number of Rapax that moved through this construction weren't small. But there was something odd about their movements. Despite the fact Ana had just killed one of their own and they were in fairly clear view of them, none seemed to react. That was when something that should have been obvious all this time clicked for Lionel. The Rapax are blind. Lionel had never noticed any eyes on the Rapax. In fact, their pill-shaped heads were covered by their metallic carapaces, so he had just assumed that their eyes were underneath and they had a method of seeing through the metal casing. However, now Lionel realized that assumption had been stupid to make. He was still trying to see everything the Rapax did through a human lens when they were decidedly not human at all. The Rapax must have used a different method to track their prey, and since they had no reason to lock onto this particular location, they wouldn't react immediately. However, Lionel was no fool. He didn't believe that the Rapax would be so inept. There was a large distance between the location he stood upon now and the perforated spherical rock that hung ahead. There was no pathway that connected it to where Lionel and Ana stood. If Lionel had to describe it, it was like they were standing in a window, looking through it. If they wanted in, they would have to find a doorway instead. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Lionel had a feeling, though, that if they truly did find a doorway, the reception wouldn't be nearly this benign. In fact, they would likely find themselves swarmed. Lionel fell into silence alongside Ana. The pair slowly backed away and retreated to the corner they had just wrapped around. Only then did they sigh a breath of relief and calmly access the situation again. They currently stood within a hallway, but there was a dead end on one side. It made Lionel a bit skeptical about how the Rapax had engineered this place. It seemed that this window was actually a designed lookout. But it was obviously not a lookout for enemies, but rather a lookout for observing the work of the other Rapax. If Lionel was correct, this confirmed one matter: the Rapax did have methods of seeing things at long distances. And, secondly, it likely wouldn't be long before the Rapax they had killed was noticed to be gone. Lionel wasn't very worried about the second possibility, mostly because at most it would just expose that there were enemies here, something the Rapax were already aware of. It was also possible that it could reveal their location, but Lionel was confident that they would have made a move by then. So it's an observation station? Ana concluded the same thing Lionel had. I think so. Then we'll need to find another entrance. But, even if we do, it'll be very difficult to handle. I can reverse engineer a path to a suitable entrance. I've already memorized the layout of that spherical hive hovering in the center of that acid lake. The issue isn't that, it's just, what would we find on the inside? If the inside is another maze, we can work with it. If it isn't, then we'll end up surrounded from all sides without a simple way to retreat. Did you notice, by the way? Ana suddenly asked. HM. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net, the anarchic force. It's still strong, but there's something oddly mutated about it, as though it feel more malleable and less aggressive. It's like a beast that's been tranquilized. Lionel's brows shot up. When Aina spoke those words, he too realized it. After a moment of thought, he felt like he had come to a conclusion, but he still reached out to Wise Star Order. Anarchic force is the antithesis of life. It's one thing for the Raypaks to force their young to be born in such an environment, but it would be another thing entirely if they just allowed the anarchic force to kill them. The girl is sharper than you. The heavy life force in the air, caused by the fertilizer, has a sort of muting effect on anarchic force. This isn't because anarchic force is being suppressed, but it's rather because the anarchic force would rather target this pure and high-level life force than target weak and unsavory babies. That vat of green is where it all is. The toxicity is concentrated in the top layer because that's where all the life force and anarchic force are fusing. The result of their combat is something high poisonous to life. Lionel nodded. He wasn't shocked Aina noticed before he did. Her life force affinity was off the charts, it was only right. But, this changed a few things about how Lionel could approach this. Firstly, muted anarchic force meant that he could use more mage tactics and that his bow force's range would be much longer. But, most importantly, he just might be able to draw a teleportation force art that could get them out of here so long as the anarchic force continued to be so docile. The formation wouldn't be enough to take them far. But, at the very least, it would be able to get them out of the center of this nest and toward an exit. There was no doubt that once they stole the egg, the Raypaks would be livid. By then, their main focus should be on running for their lives. Bang! 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 Lionel's gaze narrowed, the sudden series of sounds making him peek his head around the corner once more. There, on one of the winding paths, a group of youths charged, battling the Raypaks that stood in their way. Chapter 1367. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 1367. Wild abandon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1367. Wild abandon. The moment that group acted, it was as though a chain reaction had been set off. Several roars resounded and several more groups charged out, each claiming a path for themselves and cutting toward the perforated nest. Lionel chuckled. It seemed that his worries about being found out were unfounded. The cascading effect of the movement of one suddenly unleashed a barrage of assaults from all sides. Shall we? Lionel asked. But we haven't found a doorway yet. Lionel grinned. You didn't know? Your boyfriend can fly, basically Superman. Aina hardly got to respond before she found herself squealing. Lionel swept her into his arms and rounded the corner once more. He crouched into a powerful squat, his thighs bulging and calves compressing until they were as hard as steel. In that moment, his aura flourished, a blinding golden light enveloping his body as he was covered in head to toe by tiny white gold scales. Bang! Lionel unfurled himself all at once, slicing through the air like a speeding bullet. Almost instantly, he appeared above the green lake, a singular dot in the skies amidst a commotion. But, even then, he somehow managed to be the center of attention. Steam rolling into battle, a beauty cradled in his arms, and wings spreading to his back. In this bleak world, he was like the only ray of radiant sun, the majestic sight of his very being attracting attention from all sides. Lionel soared, feeling his snowy star owl blood rolling through his veins. He could feel it pressing against its very limits, the breakthrough in comprehension he had made in his Scarlet Star Force stimulating it all to the absolute extreme. Lionel let the feeling roll through him. He didn't move, he simply let the air whip against his skin, his eyes closed and his expression peaceful. His skin began to radiate a delicate golden color that quickly became fiercer and fiercer. In those moments, everything around Lionel was so pure that even the foul stench of the Raypak's nest couldn't approach him, the refreshing scent of a dawning day, delicate dewdrops and life wafting around him. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. There didn't need to be a check, nor a guess. Lionel's mind bloomed like a flower, stepping past the barriers of the fifth dimension and sweeping into the sixth. At that moment, Lionel's snowy star owl lineage factor had reached the pinnacle of perfection, unsealing all three branches to the fourth awakening. Boom! Lionel flapped his wings a single time, his already fast speed suddenly doubling, a violent clap of wind shredding the air to his back as he cut through it all even faster. Bang! Lionel swung his feet forward, their soles smashing into the head of a Rapax and crushing their silver skull. He landed heavily on a winding platform, already having covered more than half the distance. The Rapax crumpled beneath his feet, a heavy domain pressing down and shredding it to pieces. Aina jumped from Lionel's arms, her battle axe in tow. A single sweep seemed to sever the world itself, the Rapax in her path finding themselves experiencing just the same fate. Scree-cree. Lionel's mind felt as though it had been injected directly with adrenaline. Everything was so clear, not just through his internal sight, but through his eyes especially. He could see further, even the slightest bits of detail were laid bare before him. In that moment, things that Lionel would usually rely on his internal sight to pick up on suddenly didn't need it at all. And, just like that, the advantage the Rapax had over him vanished in a puff of smoke. Lionel took a step forward, his figure crossing tens of meters in a single bound. When he appeared again, he had seemingly already chosen the perfect position to dodge a coming kick, his makeshift spear stabbing outward and ripping through a gap that felt infinitesimally small in its plate armor. Right then, the Rapax crumbled, but so too did Lionel's makeshift spear, combusting to ash in his palm. Lionel immediately knew why that was. It seems he had gotten the spear domain to acknowledge him enough to hold a spear without destroying it, but he still hadn't gained enough acknowledgement to be able to make it acknowledge one of his creations just yet. However, this wasn't enough to make Lionel slow in the slightest. If he couldn't use a spear, then he would just use his fists. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. NetDream class. Speed fighter. Lionel's steps shifted, his body flickering and his speed reaching nigh untouchable levels. He left afterimages in his wake. Whenever he appeared, another fist would jet outward, blasting a hole through yet another Rapax. His eyes darted back and forth. It felt like there was nothing he couldn't see, nothing he couldn't observe. The twitch of their muscles, the shift in their weight, even the slight change caused by a rush of their blood was all picked up by him. Numbers seemed to float in his vision. Speed, weight, power, distance, it all branched off one after another. It was as though Lionel's dream world had manifested into reality, layering atop what was with an objective measure of what is. It would be a very long time until Lionel realized that this was the first instance of his dream force working as it should, his consciousness projecting into the world and affecting it. This is what it truly meant to have high dream force affinity. A wild grin spread across Lionel's face. Every swing of his fist and every slice of Aina's axe only made him smile all the more wildly. This feeling, it was exhilarating. Lionel shifted around another Rapax, sidestepping the tail of another as his hand reached out, snatching the curved blade with his bare palm and squeezing down. Sita-ai. The metallic tail crumbled, wild bronze runes racing beneath Lionel's scales. Lionel gave a strong pull, causing the Rapax to suddenly find itself flying in his direction, only to be met by a fist that crushed its head. He stepped over the corpse, his body swaying to one side to dodge a kick. His wings slapped outward, causing the balance of the Rapax to falter and spin. Ha! Lionel took a strong step forward with one leg and sent the other shooting straight up. His heel connected with the chin of the Rapax with such force that its head was ripped from its body. Lionel's roar bellowed through the Rapax nest, his blood flowing with wild abandon. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1368. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1368, 0. 15 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again 1368, 0. 15 Lionel left a blazing trail in his wake. Sometimes, it would feel as though he was attacking 3 different places at once, his speed so fast that it was almost impossible to keep up with. The first awakening of the speed branch merely allowed Lionel to access light elemental force in a fashion that could boost his fast twitch capabilities, not much unlike an elemental speedster, but on a much smaller and more controlled level. The second awakening gave Lionel access to the Star Road. It was the road of stars that appeared beneath his feet. Stepping onto the road made Lionel feel lighter and also seemed to weaken several forms of friction, making gliding through the air feel all too easy. The third awakening was primed for awakening with the appearance of Lionel's illusory wings and came into true being once Lionel's wings gained physical form, spreading out from his body both powerfully and majestically. The fourth awakening, however, was the most profound of them all. Lionel felt light force fuse with his very bones and flesh, suddenly making him feel as light as a feather. The difference was so drastic that had it not been for the increase to his wisdom branch simultaneously, Lionel might have had to artificially slow himself just so that his mind could keep up. Now, Lionel suddenly had a body as sturdy as any Tier 9 forged weapon, and yet instead of being weighed down, he was as light and free as a breeze of air. Golden runes shaped into delicate feather patterns danced between the bronze runes that were deeply carved onto his bones, making him feel as though he was gliding through the air as opposed to running on ground. In that moment, Lionel could feel the exhilaration of a speedster, a hearty laughter almost leaving his lips. The Morales family lineage factor was always known to be the cream of the crop because it circumvented the usual pitfalls and weaknesses of defensive abilities in ways most others could not. Despite having skin as tough as metal, Lionel hardly lost any flexibility or speed. However, when a lineage factor that was already so amazing to begin with was suddenly stacked with another that not only erased its minor weaknesses, but even turned them into strength. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Well, the results spoke for themselves. Lionel vanished, suddenly appearing above a Rapax that had just swung down a kick at full force. His toes lightly tapped the Rapax's knee, causing a strong surge of golden spear force infused with snow force and destruction to slice downward. The Rapax immediately found its leg severed at the thigh, its weight falling forward as it lost its balance. It had already been leaning forward to begin with after its attack missed, but now it seemed that it wouldn't be able to do anything at all as it fell toward Lionel. Lionel used the light touch of the tap of his foot to skip upward, his body spinning and a vicious kick landing on the side of the Rapax's pill-shaped head. The sound of metal crashing against metal resounded for just a moment before one side crumpled and collapsed. The Rapax's head was ripped from its shoulders, its head being sent spiraling into the green lake below. Lionel landed on the ground for just a moment before he vanished once more, a spiraling circle of wind being left in his wake. Everywhere he passed, arcs of light would follow his swinging kicks and fists. The outline of a beautiful dance was marked, a gorgeous white gold painting the otherwise grotesque atmosphere. 0:15. Lionel could feel the shift in his speed fighter class. The fourth awakening had caused his original 1.00 rating of himself going all out to increase, resetting the entire scale. However, even on this new scale, speed had become a relatively greater strength, causing his weakest class, which had sat at 0.07 just a moment ago, to more than double in efficiency. There are diminishing returns to such speeds. It was no wonder that even with such an enormous speed boost after reaching the fourth awakening that the Snow Star Owl would still only be a six-dimensional beast. More speed equals more power, but that's only if weight remains constant. This lineage factor gives me what feels like even more than a ridiculous tenfold increase in speed, but it does so by lowering my weight and by extension my momentum. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If not for the fact I can rely on my metal synergy lineage factor, I would have to be very careful with how I use this speed as well, or I would end up hurting myself. This made perfect sense. This lineage factor was rooted in the blood of a bird. Birds were known for their hollow and fragile bone structures. This should have been something that Lionel had expected. However, he wasn't disappointed. Right now, this boost was exactly what he needed. He was already confident before that no one would be able to stop him from getting this egg, as he always had confidence in himself. But this only made him more assured. Lionel quickly cleared the Rapax. Because he and Aina had landed in the middle of the platform and had not started at the beginning like everyone else, they were far ahead. But that came with its own problems as well. If they weren't fast enough, they would end up pincered from not one, but two sides. By then, what advantage they had gained wouldn't be worth it. However, Lionel had his own plans for this. Aina raced after Lionel, managing to keep up because of how often Lionel had to stop to battle. Any stragglers he missed were unceremoniously cut apart by her. The moment Lionel reached near the end of the platform, he released a low shout, his feet stamping down hard. A flickering golden rune lit in Lionel's irises, a searing heat dancing above his right hip. Destroy. A raging crimson aura erupted from Lionel. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.